I'm proud to say that this video is brought to you by www.ridge.com/brokensilicon, a sponsor that offers wallets with over 30 sleek designs and, most importantly, intelligent design. This wallet size matches how big or how small your life is. And of course, don't forget that they also make laptop bags. I have the commuter backpack myself, and its overall ruggedness and usability really did impress me. Make sure you use the offer code BrokenSilicon and the link in the description so they know my dog sent you. And it is also brought to you by CDKOffers.com. Offer code DIESHRINK for 3% off everything on the website, and Broken Silicon for 25% off all Windows codes. All right, on with the show. And welcome to Broken Silicon, a gaming hardware podcast. I am your host, Tom, and I will let my guest introduce himself.
Hey, I come from Ontario, Canada, and part of the reason why I'm here today is I'm a UX researcher. So basically what that means is I take different types of users and their experiences and just see how they work with different pieces of software. So what behaviors they exhibit, how do they respond to it, do they like it or dislike it? And part of the reason why I'm on Broken Silicon specifically today is I used to work at a AAA gaming studio in Ontario, Canada. It's one of the largest in the world. Without naming names, they're very, very prominent in Ontario. As well, I've had AAA games that I've worked on release.
Including recent ones and ones that haven't come out yet, right? This isn't like you used to work there 10 years ago. This is very recent.
Correct. Yeah. I think since 2018, there's been at least one AAA game that I've worked on released, and there's still more to come out. I think you're a big fan of one of them, or at least one of the franchises. But
I am.
That's basically my synopsis.
And I think you wanted me to do this in case you forgot. Your thoughts and opinions are your own right, even though you're not directly confirming who you worked for. You still want to say that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Just out of respect to my former employer and just other people that I'm going to kind of speak to their opinions. All these things I will say during the podcast are my own thoughts and opinions. They only represent my personal thoughts and opinions, not the thoughts and opinions of any company I've ever worked for.
And I guess another piece of disclosure I would put out, just to be clear, and I feel like I have to say this because all the time, you know, until things are 100% confirmed, even if it's months too early to really comment on a rumor I put out, people will say, well, here's this one article. That could mean that one source was wrong. And when it comes to sources, I don't have one source on almost anything I've ever talked about. And that includes Metal Gear Solid, Silent Hills, God of War Ragnarok. There was not one person that told me about those. And it was not you. So I want to say that up front, that it's like, I am not secretly talking to the person that told me about God of War Ragnarok. I think I have to say that up front, that not only was it not you, but it wasn't just one person. I'd be a madman to say one of those things if just one person told me.
Yeah, and a lot of those rumors that you have been dropping recently have been very interesting on my side of things, and kind of gets the gears spinning about what's happening over at Sony and a lot of the background deals they're making. And yeah, very entertaining, very interesting to see what you've been dropping recently.
Well, I'm glad you have been entertained. I guess let me ask this just to kind of make sure we cover it. When you said UX researcher, because I was like, why don't I just call you a game dev? And you're like, well, that's not really what I do. So I looked around, and it's like, yeah, there are UX researchers, user experience researchers at all types of software companies, you know, looking to take, right? Am I wrong? They look at trends. The competition, they pull together data. And then the people building the products, they're like, this is what we need to focus on. This is what's working and this is what isn't. And you did that for games then, right?
Yeah. So right now, I still maintain that type of position at a different company, but in games, I did kind of take note of user behaviors when they're interacting with specific types of games, making sure that a designer or developer's vision is actually meeting real world expectations. So maybe they design a level and intend a player to go through it in a very specific way, or they want to hit different notes. And the way that they're able to confirm that, or just kind of make sure that their vision is maintaining some sort of accuracy, is, well, we get some of the people that would actually play this game and see what happens. And a lot of the time you have issues arise or things you did not expect happen in those sessions, and you're able to adjust and resolve them so that you're able to kind of meet your creative vision a little bit easier than you would if you were to just kind of like the old model, throwing the game out there, and then you find out, oh, we didn't see that people would miss this really important armor set because it was right in front of, because of the color of the set mixed with the textures, they didn't see it. Now they had to backtrack all the way to the beginning of the level. They're super annoyed. Their whole experience is ruined. So a lot of that is of my job, is to make sure those things don't happen or tend to happen less. And another important aspect, and specifically what actually landed me a job at that AAA game developer, was the fact that I had very in-depth knowledge of the gaming industry as a whole. So I've been kind of following it for the better part of 10 years and just taking note of different trends. And specifically at that job, I would do competitive analysis and figure out, why does game A have such a high score compared to game B or our game? Why are players really responding to this aspect of the game when we also present that aspect in our game? So
why did it work for them and not for us?
Yeah, exactly. And just kind of finding your footing in the whole landscape of gaming, and where can we fit in? What can we take advantage of from other games that fit into our game? Hey, is this an important trend that's upcoming? Are we kind of making the same mistakes we did before? All those kind of fuel into the job of a UX researcher.
You know, and I think this is something that a lot of people may be surprised by, actually, how much effort doesn't just go into programming the game, coming up with the game, writing the story, throwing it together, but that it really isn't just throwing it together, that there is this, you know, critiquing and editing, not exactly the same as like directing and editing a movie or TV show, but a similar mentality of, you know, at this beat in the movie, we need to get to this scene so we don't lose pacing. And that's a thing in games. And really, when I started thinking about games in that way the most is when I noticed in Half-Life 2, there's a behind the scenes mode you can turn on, and same in Portal. And it was really interesting, like when I noticed that option and turned it on, like, I think, specifically, I think it was like Half-Life 2 Lost Coast has it. And then also Portal does. And I was walking around Portal, and I clicked the commentary button that can appear if you let them appear. And it said, so in this scene, we needed people to walk into this room and shoot a portal gun up higher. But the previous few areas had you looking mostly what was right in front of you. And we noticed play testers weren't looking up. So what we did is we put a ladder on the wall, because gamers typically see ladders as you need to look up. And then if you walk towards the ladder crumbles, thus telling the gamer you can't climb this ladder. But hopefully we made you look up so you don't miss how to solve this puzzle. Like that type of stuff, like that's actually how much thought goes into every square foot of some games. And it sounds like you touch that type of decision making a lot, right?
Yeah, that's actually a really great example of they're getting feedback from playtesters and user researchers, and not necessarily saying, and this is something you always have to really be careful about when you're in UX research, is not to give very heavy-handed recommendations. You can give, hey, we're encountering this problem, like no one's looking up when they need to do so to solve a puzzle. Here are what some other games do, but then you let the creative the devs, the designers, you let them do what they do best, which is making the world, making the game. And you come to these, you have the problem of no one's looking up, but then you're able to have this creative problem solving occur where people look up on ladders. Oh, let's just put a ladder there, and that solves the issue. And you can take, that's just one part of one level, and you can just multiply that across a 30, 40, 50-hour game, or even like a journey where it's like a very tight experience, and just figure out how to hit those emotional beats perfectly, like the way the sun pans, the colors, the button interactions, the latency of the button interactions. Like, do we want it to feel weighty or not? There's so much attention to detail in a game that can get lost in translation between design intention, developer intention, and the final product, that having playtesting and having UX researchers really helps support that creative vision when done correctly.
Yeah, I guess another thing that I want to bring up too is how often, since we're on this subject of like these tweaks you make to the game, how many problems get missed just because people are used to playing the game? Like, I remember Killzone 2, they actually had quite a bit of input lag, but the problem was the people making the game got so used to the input lag that they were really good at the game still, that by the time they shipped it, they forgot, we probably should have fixed that input lag. And everyone was like, well, they made the guns feel heavy. And when they were saying they fixed it for Killzone 3, and it was funny how everyone's like, well, now the guns won't feel heavy. And they're like, no, most of the heavy feeling is just visual. And then you play it and you're like, oh, you're right. It was just bad input lag, and they didn't notice because they had been playing the game for 4 years straight, right? Like, how many problems do you run into where the devs themselves miss that there's an issue simply because they're so used to playing the same game that it's kind of white noise?
I think it's very common, and it's very difficult when you're working on not even just games, but just projects in general, to not get tunnel visioned to where this is the only way something will work, and this is what I'm used to, and this is what feels right. And that's kind of why you need, I shouldn't say need, but why you should probably have playtesting, or just in general, like outside opinions. Like, what better way of saying, hey, this input lag's bad, by getting Killzone 1 players to come in and actually try Killzone 2 before everything's set in stone. A Borderlands 3 boss, like, get people playing that game. Well, again, they probably did have playtesters to alleviate that issue, but the earlier on you can get kind of that feedback, even if it's at like an alpha or pre-alpha state, the better, because it kind of helps alleviate some of that tunnel vision. People become a little bit more flexible to, hey, maybe we're wrong here, maybe we're wrong in other areas. Let's adjust some things. But in general, it's all these different parts kind of work together, where your designers, developers play the game, they get past a QA, that gets a build approved to keep being used, and then you bring in the playtesters, and then they discover things that QA might have missed, and then just keeps doing this kind of like revolving motion until the game comes out. And even after sometimes the game comes out too, that process continues when you're looking at patching, when you're looking at like different title updates, or just upgrades in general to the game. And hey, we weren't able to get to this feature in time, but let's keep refining it because it'll be really good for a New Game Plus update or something similar to that end. Like, it doesn't necessarily end when the core development of the game ends. It's this process that kind of never stops.
Not if the game's successful, at least.
Yeah, there you go.
But so I guess we have quite a few reader mails on this one. Many people were excited about this episode, and just it was hard to organize the subjects of our discussions into a coherent order. So I guess I'm just going to dive right in now. So Jason Thomas writes in, just like you guys can if you support us on Patreon, and asks, how much does console gaming trends affect the PC gaming space?
It's a little bit more nuanced and complicated, to where I don't necessarily think console gaming trends affect the PC gaming space inherently, because up until recently, PC gaming, I mean, even to put it lightly, was an afterthought for a lot of developers until stuff like Steam came along, stuff where the selling and monetization of games on PC started making more sense, and it was a lot more tangible. Like, I think the revenue growth in the PC space has been booming over the past 5 or so, maybe even in a shorter span of that time, to where now you are taking...
Again, the end, as I keep saying, the end of the PS360 generation, because that generation dragged on for so long, and at the same time, PC hardware was incredibly reasonably priced in like 2010 through 2013. I think there was this, and that was also the heyday of Steam sales, right, back then too. All of these things combined to where PC gaming became huge, right?
Yeah, it's had quite the renaissance to where, of course, the console gaming trends affected PC because the PC gaming space wasn't really being thought of inherently, or when you're developing a game, your first instinct when you start making a game years ago was, how can we make this play the best on the best-selling console, or just the consoles in general? Like, how do we how do we get this working there? So you can say that affects PC gaming, but what I'm kind of seeing now, and what I've just kind of heard anecdotally from people that work within video game marketing, is PC actually having an impact on the console gaming a little bit as well, where you're seeing these performance modes in games becoming more prominent, which being able to customize your game experience to your liking, at least from my limited experience with PC gaming, I think I've been PC gaming for almost a year, heavily enthusiast for the past 6 months, is having options. That's the main unique selling proposition of PC gaming. To me, that's something that's very important. And I think that's starting to trickle down into console gaming, to where you're seeing just baseline 60 FPS becoming something that's trending upwards a lot. I think for the majority of people, the difference between 30 and 60 F is a lot more tangible than 1080p 4K, just from like a viewing distance perspective. I think you're going to be, or consumers are able to kind of see or feel that difference more than they would resolution. Kind of what I would also elaborate more on this talk is, it's not just Sony making this commitment to 60 FPS, but Microsoft has kind of been very
forward. And let's be clear,
to,
you don't work at either Sony or Microsoft. I think you can say that.
It's safe to say I don't work
at
either.
I think that was kind of obvious in the beginning, but I think we have to say it because there will be some people that spread conspiracies that I brought on some Sony or Microsoft no, you work at a third-party AAA dev. You don't have any dog in the fight for either of these consoles. Your opinions are your own and aren't formed by working for either of those companies.
Correct. And I should say not worked previously. Yeah. But Microsoft has also made a commitment to 4K 60 FPS, and it was part of their initial marketing. I've kind of seen them a little bit quiet lately on it. I don't know if that's something happening in the back end, but both console manufacturers and both platforms are really pushing this idea of 60 FPS. And I think it is because you are seeing that trend more and become more popular amongst mainstream gaming consumers. And it's just going to become a more important factor as that trends more upwards, to where I think by mid-gen, you shouldn't see, exception Naughty Dog probably, but you shouldn't see any game that's running less than or does not have a 60 FPS mode. I think it'll be incredibly uncommon to non-existent unless you're Naughty Dog.
Well, so let me then ask this. Sam Borchers writes in and says, "Hi, Tom and guest. Are game developers held back by current consoles and PC performance? If there was no limit to the performance of available systems, would game developers be able to create breathtaking games that go much further than today's standards? Or are they only capable of similar levels of game improvement, with console and PC performance not being a major limiting factor?" So I guess what he's saying is, if right now, overnight, you just flipped a switch and they had unlimited performance, would they even be able to harness it?
I think in some ways, yes. In some ways, no. And I think before PS5 launch and reveal, and we kind of got a really good idea of what that SSD meant for games, not necessarily pushing out triangle, but just like it should be said, like the SSD in the PS5 has the ability, and I think you're going to see it in first-party Sony games, to fundamentally change some hangups in game design and development. The first-party games, I think, are going to be very impressive and are going to be able to do a lot. I don't think you're going to see that as a wider industry trend unless PS5 just sells astronomically. All their games sell astronomically. new types of game design that we can't even imagine right now take off. Different, like a new genres may potentially, like look how much Fortnite disrupted the entire industry of all these major developers. Now everyone's jumping on Battle Royale. I don't think it's going to have a huge effect unless it has like that seismic shift of, oh, we have to play games like this now. And it's going to take time to see if that happens. I lean on the side of that not happening, unfortunately, even though, again, from what's being described to me, it's very exciting. It's just in the wider market, in the wider landscape, it's probably not going to see a lot of adoption, unfortunately, until things catch up.
Or at least not a universal adoption. So then would you argue though, and I mean like, even not talking about the SSD, I think people talk about, is just kind of going full circle to what I brought up, like a few minutes ago, like are consoles holding back PC? I mean, I want to be honest though, when I look at the top GPU on the Steam hardware survey, it's the GTX 1060. Guys, that's about the same performance as the PS4 Pro. The most popular graphics card is a PS4 Pro that launched in 2016. And the Xbox One X that launched in 2017 is stronger than that. The PS4 base is about an RX 560 in performance, roughly, which, cards around that level of performance, like the GTX 1050 are like, I don't know where it is on the Steam hardware survey exactly. It's within the top 5. So, I mean, with the start of this new gen, I don't even know before the start of this new gen, you could argue that consoles are holding back PC really at all. I mean, certainly the base consoles are probably holding back Cyberpunk a little bit, but I mean, I just think that's something people forget is that most PC gamers don't have a 3080, right? And even now, the top most popular graphics card on Steam isn't stronger than a PS4 Pro.
Yeah, like that's a great point to like bring up, just because that is a fact. Like, you're not like, I own a 3080. Luckily, I don't expect game developers to go out and like, we're gonna make the best 3080 game out there that uses DLSS and RTX and just runs perfectly on a 3080, because it's such a small minute of people where you want your game accessible and frankly purchasable by as many people as you want. Where if you look at like what's going to be popular in PC or what is popular in definitely 2020, I know I listened to the episode where you had the OEM laptop manufacturer on and just kind of talking about laptop trends. I think most people nowadays have a TV, they have a smartphone and a laptop. Like, you can kind of look at what GPUs are in laptops or the popular laptops to kind of get a feel of what is it like, what is going to be the most popular PC components. I think all the laptops I've kind of looked at for business purposes have had around like a 1650 Ti. Like, that is probably going to be a very popular GPU. So you're going to want to, again, I don't think consoles are holding back PC. I don't think PC is even holding back consoles. The kind of asterisk there is PS5. Like, PS5 is, all intents and purposes, kind of an anomaly because of that SSD IO, to where everything is now holding back the PS5. And I think they're going to potentially successfully...
there's going to be a lot of angry comments for that one.
But I think it's going to successfully happen to where you're not going to see the level of game design and level design that you're going to see on first-party Sony games that you're going to see in other games. Whether that comes to fruition or not, that's, again, have to take time to tell. It's definitely, I can see the angry comments already rolling in. There have their torches.
But that is your honest opinion. You're not like someone who works at Sony. I mean, I guess the one thing I would actually push back on is I think you might be underestimating how much PC can just brute force the problem within a couple of years. Like, if you're developing a game right now with the PS5 in mind and PC gaming, you might say, well, our game's not coming out till 2022, right? And so maybe we target the PS5's abilities, and then we just say you need an NVMe drive and something as strong as, I don't know, it's like, I think people forget that having a locked 60 isn't guaranteed. What they could do is just kind of target the PS5's IO and then say, we're also kind of just targeting a 3900X but this game doesn't come out till 2022, right? And so, like, yeah, if you have a 3900X, it can certainly stream from an NVMe drive about as well as a PS5. And in 2 years, you'll be maybe have Zen 5, or yeah, I guess 2022 would really be like really more than two years possibly. Like, you'll have the ability to buy something that's much stronger than the 3900X anyways then. So, and maybe it just doesn't always run at 60. Maybe there's drops to 50 sometimes, but they'll say the problem will sort itself out as stronger and stronger hardware comes available. And I think you saw that a lot around the beginning of the 360 PS3 game, where I think I've come to the conclusion, actually, and this was from speaking to one guy who was a developer too, that a lot of the people that blamed bad performance on PC back in 2005 or 2006 on the console ports is forgetting that the 360 had a 6-thread processor, that the PS3 had an 8-core with like one of the cores disabled, a 7-core processor, that it really wasn't so much a lazy PC port, except that most PC gamers in 2006 had a dual core and the consoles had at least 6 threads. And I think they just were like, they'll sort itself out. And some games did sort themselves out. Some games did not. Some games like Fallout 3 took forever to run well on a quad core on a PC. So moving on to another reader mail question here. Rory the dog asks, now that the most popular ray tracing capable gaming devices will all be running AMD hardware, the consoles, do you expect there to be a gravitation in game studios to focus on AMD's ray tracing methods over NVIDIA's in order to optimize their games on AMD's less powerful hardware implementation? I think you're assuming it's less powerful, Rory. We don't really know. We won't really know the full story on RDNA 2 versus AMD pure ray tracing for years, but he goes on, or are big game studios more likely to just use minimal levels of ray tracing to ensure the game is playable regardless of hardware until we have a bit more maturity in the hardware ray tracing implementation across the board? Or do you think there will be a split between PC-focused studios and console-focused studios? So, yeah, how would you answer that?
I like that he hits on the point of that idea of focused PC, focused console. And kind of like that NVIDIA versus AMD side of things, because I think with ray tracing in specific, it's about almost buying exclusives, sort of like consoles, where you're seeing some games or land grabs that NVIDIA made for RTX, their solution that they're marketing. Like, this game runs RTX. Like, Cyberpunk is coming out December 10th, they say, and it's going to have, they say, and it's going to have RTX. AMD support's coming down the line. But there's been like a lot of marketing with the Cyberpunk ray tracing RTX. I think in the first few years, it's going to be a scenario of buying those exclusives. Like Godfall is AMD, like their ray tracing push. I think I won't comment on Godfall, but
it's pretty, but mixed reports on it.
Yeah, so even though the consoles are going to be running AMD ray tracing, if they have ray tracing, I don't necessarily think that always translates into the PC space. Again, I'm new in looking at the PC space, so I don't want to give like definitive opinions, but just from kind of what I've been gathering, how NVIDIA and AMD compete with each other as far as this game has better features if you buy an AMD GPU versus this game has better features if you buy an NVIDIA GPU. I think it's going to be case by case up until a point where, and in your question, you pointed it out, where ray tracing isn't that huge performance that it is now, that it's tessellation. It's just something that you can turn up or down. I know a lot of investment is being put into ray tracing at larger studios because it is actually a cost-saving measure. It takes a lot of work away. Like, if you can have AI do the lighting of a game and you don't have to have someone pre-bake every what happens in a Naughty Dog game, and look, like those games take forever and they look great, but they look
good, to be fair, especially for the hardware.
Yeah, ray tracing does a lot of that heavy lifting. It's just very expensive in terms of performance, and that's again something I think you're going to be seeing balanced for a while, up until, again, it's tessellation. It's just something that's not that big of a performance hit. It has like a very tangible graphical improvement, and ray tracing has another up. This might have happened with tessellation. I'm ignorant to that if it is, but also saves development time.
I think it's worth pointing out too that I think it's going to kind of be a mix of what Rory asked. I think you're going to see most third-party studios try to come up with a solution that works well on both sets of hardware, and then run it at low enough levels so that it doesn't nerf performance of both sets of hardware. But then you're also going to see games that just, in this game, the 6800 XT ray traces as well as a 3080, it turns out. Which, if you look at some games like Godfall and Shadow of the Tomb Raider, they run ray tracing pretty well. It's just, not the same as NVIDIA. But then I specifically talked to a couple developers about what's going on with Watch Dogs Legions, because that performance is significantly worse on consoles relative to PC hardware than the other games I was comparing, based on, settings and frame rates and resolutions. And it was like, well, it uses NVIDIA's black box ray tracing, and it was designed for NVIDIA. So if they would have just turned down ray tracing or not put it in the console version, it'd probably be running significantly better. And I just think you're going to have examples of games that are built around NVIDIA's ray tracing solution, unfortunately, take a bigger performance hit in general on AMD hardware. And then games that aren't, you're going to have people going, RDNA 2 performs closer to Ampere than we expected.
I think that's a 100% fair assessment.
So I guess to really put a nail in one of the conversations from a friend of mine, he asks, looking at the PS5 and Xbox Series X, is anything holding back creativity anymore, relatively speaking, for this generation compared to the last one? Like, is there anything holding it back? Or are you just going to go back to the SSD discussion?
I'm going to kind of circle it, but almost use it more of an example to where you don't necessarily, again, I'm not a developer, I work with developers, but I think a lot of the times what limits creativity is not always obvious. Like if you were to tell me, hey, if you put a super fast SSD in this console, it's going to allow for some percentage of creativity gains, I would have been like, oh, really? I wouldn't have expected that from an SSD. Something that's a little bit more tangible to me is VR. It's like, oh, you put on this VR headset, it increases immersion a lot. It's like, oh, that's like, I understand how that could happen because, again, you're putting on the VR headset. It's a 360 space. I don't want to give a yes or no answer to this. Again, I had no idea that SSDs specifically, if you have a super fast SSD, that was going to allow for different experiences. I don't know. Yeah.
Me neither, right? I think we were all thinking about load times, and in 2018, one of my first videos that isn't live anymore because it's terrible quality, I said, I think SSDs are going to be in the next gen consoles just because they're going to get to a certain point where it's common sense, which they're just going to get cheap enough. I never thought of it from the point of view of using it as like almost as a third tier of RAM or whatever. I never thought of it that way. But when I talked to developers about it, they were all like, oh yeah. And not only that, we were begging Sony and Microsoft to put SSDs in the Xbox One and PS4, and they said they couldn't afford to. And we were like, I guess we'll see you in 10 years then, because we can't do anything fundamentally new until that happens. Like apparently if you talk to a programmer, they're like, oh yeah, this is way bigger deal than load times.
Yeah, exactly. And just to be fair to the Xbox side of things, what they're doing with streaming, that could also mean different games and different genres being conceived too, that we can't imagine them because they have never occurred before. Maybe that's why they're investing so heavily in streaming. Like a lot of people, when Bethesda got purchased, they're like, oh, like Microsoft just got Elder Scrolls, they just got Fallout, they just got all these huge IP. But I think something that's gone under the radar a lot is Bethesda had some really impressive streaming tech that they had unveiled back in 2018, 2017. Forgive me, I don't know the exact date, but they showed it with a demo of Doom. And just kind of what you can see from off screen, it was fairly impressive. And if id Software is working on something like that to work in conjunction with something that's as highly interactive as a FPS and as quick as a Doom, I think Microsoft sees something with the streaming tech that a lot of us are perhaps missing, whether that means like better online functionality. But I would also keep my eye on the streaming trends as well, to where, the obvious thing.
And with Microsoft owning Bethesda, that's interesting. Yeah, I haven't heard anyone bring that up before. You just did.
Yeah, again, I think that's something that's really going up, like under the radar. And I think with streaming, the obvious things are like game demos, trying a game before you have to download the whole thing. Convenience, I can play the game wherever I go. I don't have to think about downloads or anything like that. Those are like, just like the faster SSD. It's just like, load times will be quicker. I think there's going to be unexpected results from streaming being pushed so much that we're going to be like, I didn't even imagine that this could happen. Like different types of multiplayer games, or again, like I can't say because it's very hard to imagine something that just has never existed before. But there's a lot of moving parts in the industry today, especially in 2020, that makes the industry very exciting just to see which direction it goes, what technologies are adopted, what ends up pushing games further.
So switching gears to what will end up being rather a big question for you. So get ready. My Sharona writes in and says, first, thanks for coming on. It is really appreciated. I would like to contrast two industries, music and gaming. With music, the industry seems to have a competent grasp of what good music is, good being defined as successful. And I would like to think that the gaming industry knows what would make a good game as well. Could you describe what the formula for a good game was or is, say in the 90s versus the 2000s versus what has become today?
That's fairly loaded, isn't it?
Yeah. I think it's a good question, though. Like, what made you define a game as good in the 90s, the 2000s, and now?
I think today we have a pretty good grasp of a good game versus a bad game, especially in UX research, because we're asking players before the game release, is this game good or bad? In the 90s and 2000s, I think, and kind of what you see in some of the old guard of the gaming industry is that almost like if we're going to stick with the music analogies, like the one-hit wonders, to where they figure out this formula for a song works, it sells a bajillion copies, it's on the radio constantly, and you're just like, let's try to turn out another one-hit wonder, or another hit, or another album. And I think with music specifically, over time, you kind of see that formula fail. Maybe it had early success, but it kind of ends up failing. I think with gaming, some of that is also true, to where you have people stumbling upon different game concepts. Like when 3D camera got introduced, you had Nintendo with Super Mario, you had Sony with Crash Bandicoot, Sonic,
and then you had not do so well with 3D.
Yeah, but you got to see like that specifically. That example is always very intriguing to me because no one knew what each other was doing, and you kind of saw like, they had like some crossover, some completely different ideas. Like this worked, this didn't work. To where just game dev in general, up until you had these different research techniques and data, it was kind of like, okay, this feels right. Let's put it out there. Okay, responded well. I knew how to do that. I'm going to keep doing that. I think that's why you see like Mega Man 1 through however many just being, hey, let's just make Mega Man again and make Mega Man again and again and again and again.
Let's make 10 Tony Hawks and 10 Medal of Honors.
Yeah, exactly. You have people stumbling upon great ideas and people that can execute those great ideas again and again and again. I think in the 90s and 2000s, it was just mostly, here's what we think is going to be good. Let's put it out there. And it wasn't until like later in the 2000s, the 2010s, and the decade we're in now, until they actually did have an idea of this is going to be a good game for reason X, Y, Z. But you still do get those, again, that analogy of a one-hit wonder.
Right. So, like, what do you think the model is now? Is it not that one-hit wonder, or like how it seems like that's how you would define it in the past? How would you define it now?
If you're a large AAA, you have shareholders to answer to. And at the end of the day, if you have shareholders, you're a corporation, you have to act like a corporation. You want repeatable access, you want stocks to always go up. So there's definitely, in those types of development environments, there's 100% a formula. And I think with some studios and some huge companies in general, you kind of see them getting a little bit stuck in the mud with some of their ideas. Like, this idea will always work in perpetuity because it worked with our first game. And you just see those ideas back like over and over again.
Like the, what is it, climbing to the top of a tower in Assassin's Creed. All of a sudden, Far Cry needs that. And every single game Ubisoft needs an Assassin's Creed tower.
Right. You see those kind of things happening. A lot of where my attention goes to, as far as finding great games, not a good game, which I think a good game is very repeatable. You can have a formula for creating a good game, but like those great games that kind of hit those 90s and above have a level of a risk to them because they might not work out. Like Last of Us 2 is probably one of the most divisive games of the past decade. That does not happen at a studio that is incubated and doesn't have to answer to shareholders. That would never happen because playtesting would change the, like, hey, this isn't coming across how you want it to. Maybe change this about your creative vision, or if you want players to react this way or respond well to your game, if you want your game to sell well, do these things. Where that's kind of, again, what happens in those environments where you do have to be safe. You can take risks. Don't get me wrong there, but they are very less common and more calculated risks, to where you have a Last of Us example or a Hades, to where it's just like, hey, let's just take a risk on this roguelite idea that, hey, some people hate the idea of permadeath, but let's just try it out and see if we can make it really good with a gameplay loop, which Hades is probably one of my favorites of the year, as such, like, really, they nailed like the gameplay loop with that game. That doesn't come to fruition though without risk.
You see, if that would have then happened, right? If you're saying this is an indie game, right, where there's permadeath and they kind of built a game around this concept, if that would have been the most successful game in like EA games history, you could wonder if EA would certainly go, all of our games now need permadeath modes, instead of realizing the reason it was successful is because they actually did a good job of building it around that.
Yeah, exactly.
If I could kind of summarize what you've been saying, it sounds like you're saying in the past, it was like, well, technology is getting, if I might add my own spin actually onto what you said, technology was getting so much better, so fast in the 80s through the 2000s, that the business model was, well, who's made good games in the past? Let's have them keep stumbling upon great ideas. And now that we're almost to the point where we don't have as many hardware limitations, it seems like companies are using data, like all companies seem to be this day. You might argue overly data driven, to the point where they're just like, they keep looking at statistics and going, okay, Assassin's Creed Towers works, put that in Far Cry. Okay, they liked it when there was co-op and a raid boss, put that in, add co-op to, well, it seems like I keep bringing up, add co-op to Far Cry, keep adding all of these things. And slowly though, and I think you can make this criticism of Sony too, and Ubisoft, not all of their games, Sony certainly allows a lot of risks to be taken for sure, but like almost where some of the games start to feel the same, like because it's almost too data driven. I think what I would say is that, correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying right now games are kind of, what makes a good game is they're trying to make sure it's the least risky as possible based on data, right? And that there's kind of still not sure of the best way to make games.
Yeah, I think there has to be a really good balance when you do start taking data into account and doing research with a game, that you do want to make sure that you are still keeping the creativity and heart of the game intact. And sometimes that's easy to do, sometimes that's tough to do. And it depends where that studio is, what their financial situation is like. Like I think even the Cliff Bleszinski studio, he just kept going through ideas, and then started jumping on trends, and unfortunately the studio closed down. I think it was Lawbreakers that finally did it. I might be wrong there, but it was kind of trying to get that Battleborn idea. And it was just more of like, we need to save ourselves. Like, how could we, like, okay, this is super popular. Let's just grab onto it and like get us out of here. But then maybe that's not necessarily the game that you really wanted to create. But by trying to like read the tea leaves and be like, oh, we need to go here because this is what the industry is saying. Sometimes that can have a detrimental effect to the games you make, and as well as the inherent creativity that the game perhaps once had. So it's always like a good balancing act.
I think this leads me to a reader mail from Dan, co-host of Broken Silicon. He asks, in your experience, to what extent are AAA games simply made by committee?
Yeah, and I think we've kind of spoke to that a bit, but with AAA games, it's very dependent on who you're working for and what you're doing. Certain studios and certain cultures have a little bit more creative leeway compared to others. But a lot, from my experience and just talking to friends who did the same position as like UX researchers at other developers, there can be kind of that bending of users did not like this. It was too hard. Remove it. Like a good example is if you were to throw a bunch of users in front of Demon Souls, I don't think you get Demon Souls anymore if that's like from a AAA company because of how inherently obtuse the game can be and difficult. But that is also what's very important to that game. That like the difficulty is very important to Demon Souls. So it's tough. It can be very tough, and it's tough balancing.
But it sold well, right? Sony famously refused to publish it in the United States because Americans don't like hard games. And then Atlas said, we'll do it. And I think the US version outsold the Asian version. And so it just goes, well, I don't know what playtesters you're using, but the sales spoke for themselves. Millions of copies sold. Atlas was not a big publisher, and they made AAA money for the first time in their history.
Yeah. I would say that.
So are you so sure, though, right, that if you would have tested Demon Souls, a lot of people wouldn't have said it's good because a lot of people do like it?
So to kind of clarify, I don't think Demon Souls had playtesters and it released and everyone loved it. But if you were to kind of use like a traditional research mindset or someone or kind of present that information like, hey, people are finding this game too difficult. Depending on who you present that information to, they could drastically change that game or not, or just turn the knobs too much that it's no longer Demon Souls. I think that's, again, why you have to have really good research, really good UX researchers, really strong creative minds. Because I think Sekiro, it was published by Activision. I think that was one of the, I might be wrong here, but one of the first FromSoft games that was actually play tested before. And Sekiro is a very difficult game, but
I think it's harder than Demon Souls, to be honest.
Yeah, I just finished Demon Souls Remake, actually, and I beat Sekiro before it, and I was still unsure, but I would agree with you as well, where Sekiro just...
Johnny Turbo writes in and says, hello, Tom and guest. In my experience, gathering feedback from players has been invaluable to improve the games I've made. What methods and strategies have you found most effective for gathering feedback from players? What are the things you always make sure to ask players about when talking to them? Thanks.
It is very important to kind of gather that feedback. I'm very biased, obviously. It's my job to gather that feedback from players and users. But having someone actually sit down and play the game or play a part of the game to figure out balancing or if your game is good or not, that's probably the most invaluable thing. Like I know some indie developers that will just like, or even Steam early access and stuff like that. Like those types, and Hades also comes from like that early access mindset of just continually getting feedback from the people that you are trying to make the game for. It's very important. Probably the thing you want to make sure when talking to any players about any game is, did you like it? Did you like the game? Did you like what you played?
And have you seen people not even ask that question before?
I think you can kind of get away from it too much to where, again, if you kind of go down a rabbit hole of this part of this game's bad and we need to dig, but you might lose sight of the fact that, hey, they actually enjoyed it though. Like, it's almost like developers and designers tend to take stuff like to heart, which is it has pros and cons. And some of the cons to that is that you can hyper focus on the negative instead of focusing on the positive, and asking players what they like or dislike. So even if someone says they dislike a game, but there are parts of your game that they really enjoy, hey, they enjoy some parts of your game. Let's bring those up a bit. But that's probably it's an obvious answer, but it is probably the most important question to ask to people playing your game. Did you enjoy what you played?
Well, yeah, and I look at games like Anthem that they seem to continue to try to save, even though if you would have asked me before the game came out, I'd look at that and go, what is that? Just not Destiny or not the Division 2? Who's going to play this? Like, and you almost wonder if they should have asked earlier in the game, like in the development, like, is this doing anything notable besides adding jetpacks to Destiny or something? Right? I don't know if that's an example you can touch on, like when getting feedback on games. Has there ever been times during a development process where you realized, oh, we should have asked core questions about if this game will ever be fun much sooner?
Yes. Kind of anecdotally, because the one that comes to mind is a game I joined the company I used to work for later in development, and they're just kind of how that the UX research process was handled for that game was very latent, and my manager would just kind of like give me a lot of these teaching moments along the process, like, hey, this is something we were supposed to do at this stage in development, but because we're doing it later on, here are the compromises we have to make, and these are the things that are wrong with the game that we cannot change anymore. But if we were to actually go back a year or two, have this data and information, we could have fixed it. And this is why in project B and C, we are doing that so that doesn't reoccur over and over again. So I think working on a game where that was occurring often really gave me a really good perspective on how important it is to get that information early on, especially if it can be something that's very detrimental to the game.
Well, yeah, and I think that I think this is where, and I think it's actually a character flaw I have, where I'm very much so, hey, I set out to do this, I'm going to do it, I'm going to stick to it, I'm not turning back. And I think that some of these studios should just have the character to realize some projects are best to be canceled. Like the example that no one will ever remember that much because it was never made is like Housemarque working on Returnal right now, which I think looks really interesting. But before that, they were working on a battle royale game that they decided to cancel halfway through development because they said, no one's going to play our other battle royale game. Everyone's playing Fortnite. Everyone's playing there's another one I'm forgetting. I think Apex Legends. Yeah, that was what I was thinking of. Everyone's playing DayZ. No one's going to play the fourth one, just like no one played Firestorm and Battlefield 5. I think more studios need to realize that they can just say, oh, we've spent $20 million. We can't lose this. And just realize, well, you might be about to waste $100 million.
Yeah, and Housemarque definitely came up when we were talking about Cliff Bleszinski before, to where I'd be interested to see where Housemarque is at a stage of financially where they were ready to jump ship to, and to be fair, they're actually still doing it with Returnal, but instead of going into the twin stick shooter space, going into the battle royale space and like, okay, we're going to make a battle royale. It's like, oh, what's happening? Like when I first heard that, I forget if it was a leak or if it was a legitimate story out of Housemarque, but I started getting worried about Housemarque just because those are that type of jumping on the bandwagon usually happens when studios are desperate financially. Hopefully Returnal turns out. I'm also interested in it as well. It looks very unique. and I'm hoping that
it kind of looks like Edge of Tomorrow.
Yes, exactly.
The game.
Like I actually really enjoy that. Yes, that movie's
Which
great.
I love that movie, so sign me up, right? Yeah, when I heard they were working on a battle royale game, I literally said, I think I was driving, because I was listening to a podcast, they were talking about it, and I was like, I literally said out loud, why? Yeah. Why? And it's the same with Battlefield 5. I actually liked Firestorm and Battlefield 5, but not a lot of other people did, and you can't even get a full room in there. You can't even get a game to start. You can't get 64 people to play that game mode. Everyone's just playing the usual Conquest and Rush and stuff, and it's just like, God, how much money just went into, wait, what are we doing? Everyone's just going to play Fortnite. People don't come to Battlefield to play Fortnite. And these are hard lessons these companies need to learn. But so let me switch gears again, kind of talking about difficulty levels in games. So Rafazaya writes in, I hope I said that right, and says, as an older dad gamer, I come to love story mode in some games so I can burn through games in the little time I have. But often it just seems a bit stale. It seems like there's room for improvement beyond game enemies shooting them like stormtroopers or having too much difficulty for the time I have. Do you have any thoughts on how difficulty levels might change or at least should evolve?
I definitely think that there is improvement to be made there. A few games last gen, Tomb Raider is the one that jumps out a lot to me, to where you would actually be able to tune your difficulty on the different types of gameplay within Tomb Raider. So if you really like the combat or need to combat difficulty up, but you weren't that great at puzzles or didn't want to deal with puzzles, you can adjust those independently from one another. I think that concept or that idea should probably be investigated a little bit more for players like the reader sent in, or the reader mail, just because I think that's not investigated enough. It's underdeveloped, where there's certain games to where I think everyone's experienced this, where you love one part, like Spider-Man and those, the original 2018, the original 28 Spider-Man with those stealth missions. I wanted to skip them every time, or just make them easier and not have to go through them, the motions of them. They alleviated that with Miles Morales, thankfully, because I think they got a lot of feedback on those stealth missions. But being able to tune different parts of gameplay, I think, is something that should be investigated more, especially with... I'm not one of those people that are Sekiro and Demon's Souls shouldn't have difficulty options or tuning. And even in that same breath, there's a lot of intent that goes behind those decisions, but there's a lot of room to work with difficulty, and there's a lot of work in accessibility happening right now that's really promising, and I hope that trickles down, and I think it has a little bit, but I hope it kind of trickles into difficulty options a little bit more too.
Yeah, I mean, an example. Well, one game that lets you tweak difficulty exactly how you want as well is Mountain Blade Bannerlord. They let you tweak the AI, the health of the AI, the combat ability of the AI, and your own health. And I came to the conclusion that I thought it was absurdly annoying to have one random arrow kill my character sometimes. And then that just means, well, I can't command my army. When I play Bannerlord, I'm playing it to command the army for the RTS aspects in addition to the combat. So what I did is I said, double my character's health, because I think that's frankly unfair that they can just cut the head off the snake when it's a game about me leading armies. But then I also made my character, my army soldiers AI, have no advantage compared to the enemy. And I'm like, if I lose, it's because I screwed up my tactics, right? And that's what I wanted it to be about. And actually, here's a funny example of the Stormtroopers. I remember Metal Gear Solid 4 had 6 difficulty modes or something. And the bottom difficulty mode was literally something called, the subtitle was, for people that just want the story. And I noticed, I did a playthrough just zooming through it in that mode. And I think every gun one hit killed people. And it came to the point where I was like, well, this is a little excessive. I think even someone who's playing this for the story might want a little bit of a difference between guns damage. It does seem like a lot of games don't know what to do with difficulty, where they always are too hard in some areas. I mean, I don't know. Honestly, my opinion is that there should just be one difficulty mode. And if you're finding most people think one section's stupid, maybe that section is stupid. You know, like what you need to come to the conclusion of, I think, is how is this game meant to be played? Are some areas meant to be harder? Don't add this knob, because it's like in Call of Duty where you have the hardest difficulty. All of a sudden you got someone throwing grenades like it's a machine gun, just grenade, grenade, grenade. That's not fun. That's not harder. That's just stupid. You know, and I think and then I think if you want to add a story mode, then just focus on that story mode and normal mode, because I think adding the knobs makes it very hard for developers to have the experience that it's meant to be.
I think the idea of a singular difficulty level works if everyone was kind of on an even playing field. But a lot of games, especially AAA, you have to keep in mind that this might be the first time someone ever plays a video game. I know that's like an extreme example, but those are things you kind of have to keep in mind when making a game. And then as far as like removing sections too, if the tuning aspect of difficulty is very challenging, and I think that is part of the reason why you don't see too many options being provided in most games. And even those differences, like usually you have one difficulty that's really finely tuned, and then the other ones are very coarse adjustments on that tuning, where you're just like, this feels right, but this feels off. It's very, very, very challenging to nail those aspects. Which is, again, kind of why I go back to that. I think that slider system, I think that has like a step or two in the right direction of, I want the enemies to feel like the enemies on hard, but I don't like these puzzles are just annoying. I want like turn them off or like turn them a little bit lower so that I can get the solution quicker, or whatever perhaps that is, or driving mechanics. Like for a GTA example, like how quickly your wanted level raises. Like I think there's some room there that is better. It's still challenging to tune those things, but I think having the user tune themselves kind of helps a little bit. Okay. As far as kind of like the different difficulty levels a developer makes, sometimes that even what the intended difficulty of the game is also can vary. So some studios might balance or tune normal to be the perfect way to play their game, but other developers balance hard that way. And it's like just Wolfenstein? It's very inconsistent right now, to where I think in general, the difficulty has to be a little bit more normalized. I don't know. I don't have the answers there, but there's work to be done.
No, but you're right, because to be fair, me and Dan are playing Wolfenstein Youngblood right now, and we like the difficulty spikes are just, we're like, what's happening? All of a sudden, they're just throwing 10 like tier 3 mech suit soldiers at us with laser arms, and it's like, we came to a section where we're like, this is literally impossible for us. We give up. And we just went to another mission. And remember, like, keep in mind, like, I'm not a pro gamer, but I'm the guy arguing, don't you dare make Demon Souls easier. And yet here I am in Wolfenstein Youngblood going, this is ridiculous. Who played this? This is not fair. This is way too hard. Like, if I say it's too hard, it's hard. I mean, this is
ridiculous. I've heard that about Wolfenstein, and it has completely turned me off from it. Like, the difficulty spikes in any game are just like, I like a ramp. It's
the spikes. You see my argument, though? The problem I have when you have different difficulty modes is it feels like there will be some sections that will be too easy and some sections that are too hard. I think the problem is I don't think it was the difficulty settings. I think you just shouldn't have thrown 10 laser mech suits at me out of nowhere.
Yeah, and games have been a little bit more flexible with it lately, to where either your difficulty mode doesn't affect trophies, or you can change it at any moment, so you can balance moment-to-moment gameplay with the difficulty. Those aren't really smooth fixes, or something that I think most people end up doing. I know I don't, even if I'm hitting like a wall.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Montanya writes in and says, Dear Tom and guest, I have a general question about how developers make decisions when conceptualizing, balancing, and monetizing games, why they make these specific decisions, and how they impact the experience of different demographics in the player base differently. This is a big question. He's already making it clear from the start. He goes, I'm a college student, so I do have extended periods of time when I can game, where I would prefer competitive multiplayer games that I can learn over time, have interesting asymmetric mechanics, and the freedom to play at a slower pace and win by making good decisions based on the player's extensive knowledge of the game. I have no objection towards the monetization of cosmetics or even that of guns and shooters if they are difficult to pick up and they have a place in the meta and are balanced. However, what most devs seem to do is make their games more fast-paced and more quote-unquote balanced by removing asymmetrical aspects, even when the specific theme of the game favors it. Battlefield 5 and faction-specific weapons, for example, are an option you can enable. And what I've heard is that, unlike me, the majority of the game's player base consists of people who not only have less time to play and learn the game, but also much less time to devote to an individual game session, leading the devs to make the decisions listed above. Are these decisions really justified by this fact? Does attracting a larger player base require a general simplification of the game? And is that a good metric for success and metrics beyond earnings of a specific quarter? What are the incentives and how does each studio publisher strive to meet them? Hope these are trends that are exhibited well beyond the genre of shooters, but it is an example. Hopefully, I've illustrated my point. And I will add on, Montanya, I am one of the few people that has faction-specific weapons enabled in Battlefield 5 and insist on the Japanese only using Japanese weapons. But yeah, go on. How would you touch on all of these things he's saying? And I have noticed this, how over time, less and less asymmetrical game modes are appearing in games, unless that's the whole point of the game.
I think from the perspective of an asymmetric multiplayer game, it's very hard when you're trying to, for that asymmetrical game to be balanced inherently. And even it can sometimes even struggle with learnability, like your ability to learn a game, pick it up very quickly, start playing, and the developer and the game has grabbed your attention and you're going to be repeatedly playing. If, at least from my experience with some asymmetrical games, I played one of the few people that played Evolve. A lot of the time, that kind of asymmetrical multiplayer experience was frustrating when you didn't have teammates that also knew which role to play. And even as in that game, playing as the monster, I forget what they called it, but like the monster. Yeah.
I've played it before. The monster, I always got Shrek.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you playing as a monster is very, very easy because you can almost rely on no one being coordinated in that game. So
no, I had the opposite experience. When I played, I couldn't catch a break.
There you go. I think most of the time I would only win if I was monster rather than the people trying to take them out. But I think the main reason why I don't see a lot of them is the fact that it was so reliant on team behavior. I think you actually seen a little bit of team behavior come back with stuff like Apex implementing non-verbal communication methods. I think that's a huge innovation right now in multiplayer.
I love that.
Yes, because most people will not use a mic, period, and will not. And yeah,
I don't want to hear them either. Shut up.
And then even more so, people are very unlikely to talk to people that they've never met before. So having those nonverbal communication methods help a lot. But I think, like brass tacks, the asymmetrical multiplayer games and multiplayer modes, they probably, again, I'm ignorant to the Battlefield 5 example, but the developers on the back end and the publishers, the people that fund these games, aren't seeing the level of engagement they want to see in these modes. And you can contribute that to different behavior factors. But at the end of the day, if you're not seeing something you enjoy in games, in that same game go forward, it usually means that that experiment or that mode did not work out for the developer. They don't want to invest in it anymore because they can invest in other aspects to get themselves a better return. So
Well, and he kind of brought that up too, where he and me like using German weapons with the Germans, which the game has so many guns that you still have like 4 of each type of weapon to choose from, and that's why I do it, because I just think it's fun to use English guns if I'm the English. Like, most people aren't doing that. And a lot of people are paying to just auto unlock every weapon so they don't have to unlock them. So I guess that's what you're kind of saying too, is it's like, well, while we may like them, well, a lot of the most hardcore probably beg for them. That's not, unfortunately, what most people are asking for. But I don't think it's really, I don't think he's specifically referencing asymmetric focused games and being asymmetric to themselves, like Evolve, like you brought up. That game is built as an asymmetric experience. But examples I would bring up is like in SOCOM Combined Assault / SOCOM 3. My favorite game mode was Convoy. So this wasn't a game built around asymmetric gameplay, but they would have game modes and maps where one team might have extra Jeeps than the other team, right? Or one team has a tank and the other doesn't. But they did their best to balance it so you have ways of taking it out. And like in the game Convoy, like one team literally had to escort these transport trucks to locations, pick up supplies, defend them during like an ambush in the desert or something, and then get out of the area. That's entirely asymmetrical, even though the game isn't built around it. And I think you used to see that a lot in older Battlefield games as well, where one team, like the Chinese, would have more tanks than the Americans and an extra helicopter. But the American helicopter that they got was stronger. I know it's hard to balance, but I always thought the maps that like really gave different teams different types of weapons, and like D-Day landings, where it wasn't just you have 5 tanks, you have 5 tanks, equal is equal. I always found those maps the most engaging because of how different the gameplay was. It wasn't just everyone on both sides scrambling to do the same thing. You had people doing entirely different things to try to win.
I think, so after hearing that, I think it kind of goes back to how difficult that would be for someone to learn, and that potentially impacting how popular that mode is, or even how fun that is. So if you've kind of seen those different modes disappear, start going away a little bit, or you're not seeing new games with those types of modes, I think it has a lot to do with those factors. I have very limited experience looking at the multiplayer game scene, but just from a behavior standpoint and kind of extrapolating some other knowledge from other areas of gaming and player engagement, I'd probably chalk it up to that more than anything.
Well, it's the holiday season, and you know what that means. Lots of travel. For this holiday season, and hopefully for a more open 2021, I bought a studio laptop for mobile editing. And of course, well, it didn't come with an open license of Microsoft Office, and those can be very expensive, especially for the professional version. But luckily, I was able to get Microsoft Office Professional for a reasonable price from cdkoffers.com. Go to cdkoffers.com and use the promotional code BrokenSilicon to get 25% off an already cheap list price of Windows 10 Professional. Then all you do is click on your email account, go to User Center, and then My Purchase Orders to get the code. Just use this code with a normal download of Windows 10 Professional from Microsoft's website. All right, links in the description. Let me see here. So let me move forward here a little bit. Moving on kind of to gaming trends. Let's just go with the reader mail. Angelo says, what trends and habits going on right now surprise you in the gaming industry?
It's a good one. Something that's very surprising is the adoption of Fortnite as a marketing tool and not just like gameplay. Like
unveiling Big Navi and Fortnite.
That, having Travis Scott concerts and having this huge set piece developed and created around that. Roblox, I believe, is doing something similar. But this alternative method of monetization in these freemium games, where it's not just in Fortnite the V-Bucks and cosmetics, it's not like the loot boxes, it's not just the battle pass, but also having it be a marketing channel for like these huge juggernauts. I believe Marshmallow also was on Fortnite at one point. I forget the Roblox performer, but that is something that I never really foreseen. Like, I think everyone's kind of experienced in-game advertisements, like baked in, like Death Stranding had like the Monster Energy stuff. I believe we even talked about like a Monster Energy ad in Gears 5 previously.
Offline in a discussion.
Yeah, those I think are kind of,
or like constant advertisements in Metal Gear games where they always have ridiculous game things in there.
Yeah, like I think those are fairly obvious that they would happen. Like in the sports games too. Like I think UFC caught a little bit of controversy because they had like the boys ads plastered all over the different ring. Like, so I watch UFC, and what they did in game was almost exactly what you see during a UFC event, where it's just like the advertisement before the ring announcement, the advertisement before that, but they're actual ads. I think that's kind of getting a little bit too, if you even want to call it realistic for me. But in the freemium games, having them as huge marketing channels, having them as like huge event, like that's like one of the new theaters. Like the new theater is Fortnite. Like, oh man, play at Fortnite, you'll get X amount of money and X amount of views, and your album will do this amount better, or your movie will do. Like, I think Christopher Nolan also took advantage of Fortnite and did like some kind of screening. So it's
for Tenet or what?
Yeah, I don't think it was. I think they showed Inception. I'm sure someone will correct us, but they had like some kind of weird screening going on. But that is not something I really ever foreseen. But now that it's here, I don't think that's going away. And I think you probably will see developers and publishers, especially like huge juggernauts in the industry, try to make their own channel for events, for marketing, not even just to push their own products, but just have that as revenue to fund this freemium game and increase engagement, because like it's can be super lucrative. And I haven't looked too much into the financial details of how much Travis Scott paid to be in Fortnite, or how much Fortnite paid Travis Scott to be there, or like the back end, how many players increased that month for Fortnite. But that's something again, not something I ever foreseen happening. I think it's here probably to stay. I don't think that's going away.
I don't know why I don't know why it wouldn't be. I would just say when it comes to ads in games, what annoys me, specifically the Gears of War 5 thing, I have no problem walking around in, let's say, a Watch Dogs, and on the billboards downtown, they show an actual ad, but I don't really have to watch it. It's actually part of the design in the background. That type of stuff makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it's quite literally common sense that they would try to make some money doing that. Go for it. I don't care. But what annoys me in Gears of War 5 is when I boot up the game. But literally an ad stops me from playing the game. And I thought I paid for this. I guess not. I guess I don't own this if I buy a Microsoft game anymore. That's what annoys me. Or in Death Stranding, for some reason, his canteen was filled with Monster.
Yeah, that was super jarring to me.
Again, Monster. Monster seems to be in a lot of these ones I don't like, I'm noticing. And Death Stranding is one of my favorite games of all time. But that's what made it all the more jarring, this narrative experience. And they're like, drink some Monster Energy. I was like, how much did they pay for this? I hope they paid a lot for this placement, because it's just ridiculous,
Kojima.
Like that's, or like what if in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, all of a sudden you just start having Pepsi ads show up somewhere? That might as well have been what happened in Death Stranding, because it just makes no sense for the time period or place.
Yeah, I think with the Death Stranding and just Kojima games in general kind of playing around with advertising, I think it kind of comes from Kojima's appreciation for Western society and just like pop culture. He loves all of that.
I kind of think he sees it as an inside joke.
It might also be that too. Like, he's a very unique, creative guy, so I wouldn't put that past him. But as far as immersive advertising goes, I think I'm in the same camp as you, to where if it's just like I'm in GTA and instead of like although the parody ads in GTA are quite funny, some of them like are pretty good. I wouldn't mind seeing an immersive ad. It's when it's super jarring. It's almost mobile-esque, where like the Gears example, where it's preventing you from playing the game.
Almost like a mobile game.
I think that's when it kind of goes a little bit too far.
Guberian writes in and says, how has the mainstreaming of video games affected the industry as a whole? Because I think you can say they're fully mainstream now. I think this is something me and Dan are going to talk about in a later episode. But just how, like, even just like 5 years ago, you would see celebrities on late night talk shows like, he plays games. And we're like, everyone plays games. And now, as of this year, you have, was it Henry Cavill, the guy who plays Superman in DC movies? He's just like, I don't know if I got his last name wrong. He's just like building a gaming PC on Twitter, and it's like no one bats an eye if you play games anymore. I would say now it truly is mainstream in the culture.
Yeah, I would say so as well. Especially like this year, game spending is astronomical. Like PS4, Xbox One did better than any final. Usually previous gen consoles die the same year that the next gen console comes out, and that did not happen this year. It's definitely an anomaly, but I think that speaks to how much people are spending in the industry. So I kind of take a little bit more of a financial perspective with this mainstreaming of video games, where I think you get a lot of people interested when there's money to be made. Look at Google with Stadia, Amazon with Luna. I think those are very far out bets. I think they're ready to lose money on both of those investments for the next 10 to 15 years before they're successful. But when anything really gets mainstream and starts having like a huge economy around it, you get these players from outside of that industry involved and trying to make their buck. And again, kind of to go back to previous conversations we've had, that idea of being accountable to shareholders. I think you see a little bit more of that coming down the way, but at the end of the day, more eyes on gaming is better for gaming, even if it's not necessary.
Is it? Because that was something me and my brother were talking about the other day. Like this idea, I always see that too. Like whether it's this or it's like, you'll be like, I hear it about other things like, more people getting into Dungeons and Dragons is good for Dungeons and Dragons. Surprise, I used to play Dungeons and Dragons, everybody. I know this PC dork who also played Dungeons and Dragons. It's a huge revelation. But like, but like, is it good for Dungeons and Dragons? I think they make enough money. Is it good for gaming if there's more gamers? I think the acceptance of it is not this nerd fest. Again, right? Even as far as just 5 years ago, they were like, "Oh, that's nerdy." It's like, is it? Everyone plays games.
Yeah, I think it's better. I think it's better for the smaller developers, because right now, a developer, like a small indie developer, has to have a certain. If you just want to say like the gaming audience, they have to have a certain percentage of the gaming audience buy their game in order for them to be successful. And the more people you have in that gaming industry, the less that percentage of the audience needs to buy your game. We're not talking about like millions of copies have sold for these indie developers, but it's the more people you have there to sell your game to, the better off you're going to be, as especially the smaller side. So I definitely see it perhaps improving things for the smaller developer. Now, I can definitely see it going the other way, though, to where it starts only benefiting those bigger developers because they just kind of act as a vacuum and suck everything out. Like, I think a lot of the moves that THQ Nordic are making with all their rapid purchasing is actually preparing for the next.
What do they have, like 60 games in development according to them?
They've hundreds. I think that might,
we'll see what happens. Apparently, just get ready, because in 3 years, people, we might have a situation where every week there's a THQ game coming out.
I think a lot of their moves are actually preparing for the next 5-10 years to where gaming publishers are like record companies where they're constantly licensing out songs. You're going to be licensing out your games to different services. So even though it's definitely odd that this one publisher is buying all these studios under these different umbrella publishers. I think I read into it a little bit and just see that, oh, they're preparing for down the line to where you're not necessarily paying for a game, but you're paying, like, as far as here's my $60, $70, you're streaming the game and you are now the mainstream. I'm not talking about like people that are still going to be using hardware and stuff like that. But when the industry goes from, I think right now, 250 million, when it goes to 1 billion in perhaps 10 years, like how are those 750 million people going to be playing games? Like console hardware, whether it's gaming hardware in general, is very cost prohibitive, and you don't really get to that 1 billion number by charging people even $300 for a console. You get it from not charging at all to very little. And I think when you're looking at the mainstreaming of video games and where it could kind of like the suction to happen is just with the gaming industry becoming more mainstream and more people playing games and stuff like that, you definitely have a chance for those smaller developers to make a name for themselves and have more opportunity than they perhaps have now. But it can also swing the other way as well. So it's the next 5, 10, 15 years of the gaming industry are probably going to be the most important for its longevity.
So piggybacking on, this THQ subject, I actually think this leads perfectly into talking about the next subject, which is kind of the future of AAA games. I think one way I would read into what THQ is doing, which I think it's an interesting thing to bring up, I think most people just stop at the surface level and go, oh, they're just buying everything they can, and then they just stop talking about THQ. I think you could argue that the future of AAA gaming they're planning for is one where it becomes more AA. Again, like you see, and this is, obviously just kind of my opinion to a certain extent, but so many mega publishers in the gaming space right now seem to be insisting on making the next Fortnite, on turning a franchise into more of a Destiny 2 instead of just making a solid 30, 40-hour game. And kind of with the exception of Sony's first-party games, it's becoming rarer and rarer to find a AAA game that's just a solid kind of like, what I mean, Half-Life 2, Doom, just a solid 20 to 40-hour game that you play from start to finish, doesn't overstay its welcome, and is fun. Yes, it is not a 1,000-hour open world game or an MMO that you can play for 10,000 hours, but it has really good graphics, it's really polished, and you had a fun time for, say, whatever amount of time. I think as the gaming industry gets bigger, we could go back to this model, hopefully, where there's a lot of games like that. And maybe that's what THQ is preparing for, is churning out a bunch of AA games again. I don't know. I mean, like, what do you think about the future of AAA games? I mean, offline, we've talked about how so many of these franchises from publishers are trying to just become another Destiny or Fortnite.
Yeah, I think as far as where you're going to see those mainstream trends go and whether there's a space for the AA again, I do think that's true and kind of harkens back to the more people willing to spend money within the gaming industry, to where you get like a chance for those indie developers, single A developers, and AA developers. More people, like, you don't have to attract us like a huge percentage of the gaming audience in order to make a successful game, hopefully in that 5-10 year span, to where you can, hey, let's just spend $20 million on this game and our return for this game is going to be 30 million. And we're able to easily achieve that because of how many people are willing to pay for a game. I think I think why you saw like THQ go away is there just wasn't a sustainable amount of people doing that sort of thing, not willing to, either it didn't hit a quality bar for them, they weren't willing to spend I think.
Well, yeah, because I think I would kind of push back and say, what do you think about this insistence on making these $200 million games that a lot of them are just falling apart? Like, dude, Watch Dogs Legions is getting panned. And that's not like a Fortnite clone, but like it seems like they just insisted on, I think the Watch Dogs story itself is an example of, from the beginning, they said, Ubisoft goes, we only make franchises that are meant to be trilogies. We want Watch Dogs to be the next Assassin's Creed. And it just never was. Watch Dogs 2, although that one actually got good reviews, did not sell well. And it looks like Legions is already half off pretty quickly after it was made. I think, how much do you think AAA devs are just learning the wrong lessons in the way I would argue THQ did? Other people, Grand Theft Auto Online so successful, Destiny 2 is so successful, and they say, well, we got to have that, instead of maybe saying, well, maybe we need to go in the other direction. I think so many more of these studios need to go in the other direction. Just make a $100 million 40-hour game that sells 5 million copies and stop trying to sell 20 million.
I think it has more to do with a game's engagement. And engagement as a factor in how much people value a stock or a company, it has become much more important over time. Like you see huge, and a good example of this is with social media, with Twitter, Reddit, Facebook. I recommend everyone watch The Social Dilemma just so you can kind of see how things over time have shifted towards engagement and trying to keep you in app. I think what perhaps some of these companies are trying to do is maybe not even putting a monetary value on it, but as far as how do we make a very engaging game? Like, what are factors that make a game engaging? Like, why is Fortnite very engaging? How can we replicate that or try to make a game Fortnite level engaging? And I think you and I have also discussed like the winners and losers mentioned on like not everyone's going to win this. I think in social media too, like I don't think all those companies are going to win or have like the most intention.
No, and you see people talking about all of these new social media apps, and it's like, well, they're a year old. Let's see if they're even here in 3 years. I mean, Vine died. Like they're not all going.
Yeah, but I think a lot of these companies are after engagement and taking their ideas and trying to figure out different ways of making them engagement and investigating ideas that have worked in the past, like Apex Legends, like the Battle Royale example. Like, hey, Battle Royale seems to be engaging. Can we make like Apex Legends engaging and attract an audience and have that audience keep returning so that they spend more money? Because again, engagement, whether it's microtransactions, data that you can use in future games, is very valuable to these companies. And just the way that the social economy or just the economy in general is going towards, engagement is a very important factor for investors. So if you're able to say title A has the most engagement out of any title in the franchise, and this is what we did, and we invested $50 million, but look at our engagement, that looks very good to investors compared to perhaps, hey, we made this 30, 40-hour game that when people were done with it, they sold or stopped playing.
Well, I think it looks good to investors in the short term, but I just think maybe, again, right, you see this fallacy of engagement means this is the best thing. It's like, well, yeah, but that engagement was already spent on another thing you were looking at. Why are you so sure you can duplicate it? And the amount of money it would take to duplicate the engagement that was got out of a game like Minecraft or something. It's like, you understand, guys, it's not easy to duplicate that. And that if you spend $500 million trying to launch this gaming franchise that is aiming to duplicate the success of Assassin's Creed, that in effect you could actually be making a far riskier move than making 5 $100 million games where maybe one fails, but the other 4 make a profit. Because you're basically putting all of your eggs in one basket, is the argument I'm making. And there will be winners and losers. There will be Anthems and there will be Destiny 2s. And you're basically instead of having a situation where you flip 5 coins and, hey, 3 of them turned heads, we're still okay, you're basically betting on flipping a coin once. And yeah, it might work out for one company, but another may just go out of business. And that's what happened to THQ. They decided, well, everyone's flipping 1 coin at a time, so we should try. And they weren't as good at it. And it was a mistake.
Yeah, like there's something I inherently disagree with there. I don't think it is too sustainable or unsustainable. I don't see it leaning too far one side or the other at this point.
For either situation?
Yeah, I think this is more of like probably a 5-year retrospective that we'd probably get a good idea of all these people that rushed into like a Fortnite model. How did it actually turn out? Is Fortnite still around? Did investing in Destiny 2 all those years actually mean something good for the developers and the publisher? Did that end up turning to be a flop? And I don't think now someone who's in economics and dives into stocks regularly probably will know better than I. But at this point, I don't think there's really a conclusive answer there yet.
Oh, I would say that I'm not sure I'm right because it's not been proven right yet. But this is a fear I have moving forward, where you see so many people asking, why are all of these games, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself, right? Why are all of these games so long? Why do you expect me to play this for 1,000 hours? I'm a busy person. I don't have time for this. And it's like, well, because when we make these 1,000-hour games, they're so successful. And it's like, well, you look at Watch Dogs and I go, are they? I just think I'm not saying I'm right, but I do think it's a question people need to start asking, where it's like, is it actually, because I think what's happening, and this is just my own, argument here that I've been thinking about lately. I think the argument a lot of AAA developers would make is that, oh, well, we're being less risky. We know we're not being as innovative. We know we're not being maybe even as divisive in a good way like some other games are being right now. But that's because we can't afford to fail, so we're being as safe as possible. But I almost think there is an inherent madness and risk in being too safe, because if you make something too safe, it starts to turn into, well, you took the risk of not doing anything at all, right? Of opening your mouth and no words came out. You were so safe that you didn't make a game.
Yeah, exactly. I would tend to agree with that for sure, where it can be, when you're spending $200 million on a game, it can be crippling to the fact, like, how are we going to make that money back? Okay, we need to include these, like, I think multiplayer was like a huge craze. Like, you have to include multiplayer in your game.
Yeah, it was hilarious. How many games had to tack on multiplayer that no one played? So Joshua Rogers writes in and he says, hi, Tom and guest. I've noticed that a lot of the games that I play try to do very similar things, like have cosmetics you can buy, try to be always online, have an open world. Do you think this type of consolidation is something we're going to see more of?
I don't think every game is going to be like this, but as far as the cosmetics you can buy, I think those are probably staying, at least for the time being. Open world seems to be somewhat trending downwards. So I don't think open world will be something we see in the future. It's all about, I know I'm kind of going back to like the economic reasons of games, but it all goes like, what is working? What is making us the most money? Right now, that's cosmetic microtransactions, having multiplayer and having like multiplayer that tries to keep you on the hook for as long as possible. Not just putting it in, but trying to maintain your attention while you're playing it. I think as these these are only trends that have been discovered recently. I think as you see different aspects of games or features of games or monetization methods of the game catch on, you see those being included in a lot of those high production value, huge AAA, like millions of dollars of development titles, because they want to make sure they get their investment back. So I think it'll be a continual feeling out process of this worked, this doesn't work, this used to work, this no longer works. Let's try this, let's try that. Just like seeing what sticks on the wall, basically.
Josh Law writes in and says, how do you feel loot boxes have affected the gaming industry, specifically the quality of games overall and player enjoyment? Do you feel like some games, like, for example, Shadow of War, were ruined by their inclusion? To which I'll add on, I liked Shadow of Mordor. I never got Shadow of War because I heard the loot boxes ruined the game.
I think you see a lot of, I don't know if we could say a lot of, but I think many people share your opinion to where, and even me to an extent, where if I see a game has loot boxes in a single player game, I'm very turned off by it. I don't want that experience of feeling like I need to earn these things or need to purchase them. But loot boxes have heavily influenced, like they're trying to figure out how to sell you more loot boxes right now. They're pushing back on laws and legislation being made, and there's huge gaming lobbies that are trying to make sure that nothing like this gets considered gambling or banned for children because of just how profitable and lucrative these loot boxes can be, not only in multiplayer games, but again, something that turns you and I off in single player games. As far as how those affect
it really turns me off too. Like when they like you'll play a single player game and you'll be like picking up gold, but then one thing will be like diamonds. Again, in Far Cry, I think. And, diamonds are like gold, except you can pay for them.
Yeah, as far as affecting the quality of games overall and player enjoyment, it really is a case-by-case basis and implementation based. And your threshold for those sort of things. There's certain games, none are coming to mind, but that I can look past the loot boxes, because I think actually Gears of War 5, I know we gave that monster example earlier, but the loot boxes, at least for me, aren't that attractive. And I'm mostly playing Gears 5 right now for the horde mode. So it doesn't really bother me that. Now, do I like the fact that in Gears 3 I could earn all my cosmetics? Yes, but that's just not the state of the industry anymore. And I think paying for map packs is honestly worse than cosmetic loot packs, just because of how much it segments your player base and usually ends up killing your game way earlier than it should have. So in that light, I think having ways to pay for your servers for a game that don't segment your user base. Now, when you get killed by someone with a cool looking skin, you're just like, oh, and he has a cool looking skin, he paid money, like I'm better than him because I didn't have to pay money for my game. I think it's...
I don't know. I think he killed him. I think he's better.
But I think just the different monetization models will always evolve over time. I do think for certain multiplayer games, the loot boxes are better. So cosmetic loot boxes, not pay to win loot boxes, but the cosmetic loot boxes are a better solution than the map pack. But I don't necessarily think that loot boxes or in-game monetization for multiplayer games and sometimes single-player games is in its final form yet. I think it's always going to be ever-changing.
Well, yeah, and that was the next point I had, which we're getting into, is when it comes to microtransactions, $70 versus $40 games, subscription services, free-to-play, in-game ads, which of these are sustainable? Well, I think here's the best way to ask the question. So let me count them. Microtransactions, 1, 70 or 40, just get different game prices, subscription service, free to play, and then in-game ads. So I guess 5 different things. Like, how would you, if you were making like an open world RPG, how would you be trying to make that money back? Would you be one of those people that advocates, you know what, just make it $70 and give them all of the things they could ever want? Or would you say make it $40, but then you have to buy premium DLC packs? Or would you try to make it more towards the free to play? Like, how would you design like a standard open world game, to make its money back?
I think it definitely depends like how much you've invested in the game, when you think you'll be able to get recurring revenue, whether that's through like subscriptions, microtransactions, or the sequel. Like if you're planning to, I'm just going to put this $70 stamp on the game and that is it. Is that enough money to not only give me a return on the development cost of the game I just released, but is that enough to help fund the next game and the next game after that? Those are kind of factors you have to take into account when you're at a developer, at a publisher. As far as me personally, I like the idea of paying more upfront, whether that's 70, 80, 90.
It depends on the game, right?
But I think that also becomes cost prohibitive as far as you go, like I think maybe now, depending on the value of the dollar, I think maybe in 10 years we can do a push to 80, but just the number 80, like I live in Canada, games are $80. PS5 games, or sorry, PS5 games are $90. For some reason, Godfall is $93 here. Yeah, awesome. It's just like, oh man, paying that a little bit extra to experience Godfall.
Well, it has ray tracing, so I mean,
exactly,
it's worth the extra $3.
It's the perfect launch game. And I've kind of talked to friends just in Canada, like, hey, and I know in some countries this is the case, but paying $100 for a game.
In Australia, like I've heard 120 has been there for a while.
Exactly. Like that, I think for American consumers, I think that becomes a huge turnoff. And $100 is something that's very tangible in people's mind. Like there's a reason why things are $99.99. What I would do is probably do like the $70, $80 and have some non-intrusive microtransaction thing. Not because I want to be greedy and just like get all the money. I'm kind of talking as if I were to run a studio. It's just more, how can I...
That's fine though, because we have to be honest. This is somewhat of our opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? You know, we're playing armchair here.
Yeah, exactly. Very armchair. But I would want to make sure that if the game's great, and first of all, making a great game, but making sure that I'm doing it in a sustainable way to where if I have people depending on their salary from me, I'm going to be able to pay their salary for the next 5 years after I drop this one game. I think the way you do it is whatever the market price of a game is. I'd be interested to see actually like a Cyberpunk releasing for like 80. Like what happens there?
I was going to say, like, I know some people wouldn't pay this much, but I pay $100 for Red Dead Redemption.
Yeah, exactly. 2. Like I probably do that as well.
Maybe you wouldn't if you're listening. I would. I would.
And I think people have definitely done that with like we're also not factoring in deluxe editions and digital advanced editions. Yeah. There's Red Dead Online, which makes a lot of money. There's different ways of charging. I think games have been charging more than the price tag you see on a game for a long time. It's just optional, and as long as it does stay optional and it's not begging you on, it's, for like, to be frank, ethical. If it's ethical monetization where, again, like I wouldn't want someone who has $70 can't play my $80 game. Like that would feel really bad. I think that feels bad for a lot of people. I think most people some people are in that scenario where they had $60 to buy a game on Christmas. For whatever reason, they could afford a new console, but now they don't have like that extra 10 to just go with the $70. I think that kind of starts happening where if you allow these microtransactions to happen and you have people that are willing to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on these microtransactions to kind of even out the playing field, you create a sustainable development. We're not talking the most profitable. Have to look more into like, hey, is $70 sustainable for developers that take 5 years on games? Like, if they sell X amount of copies, can they fund? I haven't dove too much into that, but I think those are like all the factors that kind of would go into my decision of like a $70 game, whatever the baseline is for a game, as well as having these non-intrusive ethical microtransactions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I would answer this is it obviously, like you're saying, first make a good game, and then I think what you should go into is just stop thinking about how much you need to add to the game to make it worth the $60 or the $70. Like when I look at some of these, more linear first-person shooters, and you'll know when you play some of these games and it's like, all right, now we're to the boss. Oh, the door is jammed. You got to go back to cell block, blah, 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 to open it up. And it's like, you just did this so that I waste 10 minutes so that you can say it's a 20-hour game. That's the only reason you did this.
Padding, yeah.
That's not always true. Sometimes there's a reason, but it is. And I'm like, why don't you do this? Why don't you remove the padding? Why don't you stop wasting money on adding these, and all of the man hours adding these side missions I don't want to play? Make a $40 15-hour, 20-hour game. Make it a $40 game and just remove the crap no one wants to play and just make it good for $40. And then instead of worrying about this DLC, just make a standalone sequel that takes a year less to make. I think there's a lot of games where they should be doing that. And then, I think there's other games where, like we've said, like maybe a Cyberpunk or Red Dead Redemption 2, where you're like, this can cost $70. It's out of your face. It's out of your way. But it should be. It should just be an expensive, big open world game that you buy and you own. And I'm sorry, like if there was some point I was riding my horse in the single player and it's like, we just came across these diamond chests, which means if you pay extra money to like, that would so take me out of the experience to see that I would want to throw my disc in the oven and turn it to broil. Like, what are you doing? You just could you imagine like Kratos in a game just like, nice, I got diamond chests. Like that'd be the dumbest thing on earth. There are some games where that works, and there are just some games where it doesn't. And then you just need to decide, well, is this a $70 game? Then sell it for that. If it's not, stop wasting development time. Stop wasting 6 months of the development time padding it out and just start on the sequel sooner. I think that's something that we're not seeing nearly enough people do. And yeah, when it comes to, in-game ads, only works in some games. And you just have to deal with that. And then when it comes to, paid, free to, the skins online crap, as long as I can unlock a few skins to customize myself, I don't care if other people are running around with skins. Although I have to say that I am getting a little tired of the Fortniteization of some games where it's like, does it really make sense this guy just has a green mohawk and a pink gun? It kind of makes this modern military shooter look stupid all of a sudden.
Yeah, I definitely like how Sony is playing around with price points and game lengths. Like with Miles Morales, I really enjoyed my experience with it, not because it was necessarily cheap, just because it was cheaper, although that definitely makes it's a very attractive proposition to say this Spider-Man game does not cost as much as the last one. That
we just finished it in 2 years, and we're instead of working an extra year adding useless side missions, we're going to sell it for $50 and release it sooner. Well, come on, guys, do that.
I like seeing price points being investigated. Not every game have this arbitrary benchmark of this is what you have to do to make your game cost $70. I think some bigger AAA developers third parties are less likely to do that for their franchises just because I think in their mind, they feel like they risk devaluing the franchise so that when they do release a game that they feel is worth $70, which they should always do, but let's say the previous entry was $50 and now they're trying to sell you $70, that could potentially create an unforeseen problem for them. And it just might be a risk assessment where, hey, we don't want to do this to this specific franchise. But I think overall, just investigating price points a little bit more can help alleviate a lot of financial worries and perhaps some of these microtransactions, loot boxes that people are seeing in, especially in free-to-play games. But overall, just different monetization monies, making development costs back, that all can definitely be investigated more and adjusted on a game-by-game basis.
Miles writes in and says, with the splintering of how Microsoft and Sony will be delivering their first-party exclusives, Games Pass versus $70 with no microtransactions, did anything you found in player habits research show which of these approaches might be the one that wins out? Or is it mainly going to matter about the quality of games in the end rather than the price? Also, do you think the subscription model will grow on PC if Microsoft succeeds? Services like EA Play have not really been taken by PC players yet. Which tells you why they partnered with Microsoft, because it was unsuccessful. They need to partner with Microsoft.
Yeah, exactly. That's nothing really in the research that I did kind of showed an attitude towards the subscription base versus the $70 price. So this is just kind of more going off of a personal opinion than any type of research I actually conducted myself.
You're not disproving it. You're saying there just isn't info to suggest either way.
I think this is going to be something we have an answer to by the end of this generation. just to see is Game Pass rewarding financially for Microsoft to continue, or are they going to go back to releasing $70 games, or maybe they do this balancing act of you have your Game Pass subscription now and they've actually kind of already done a little bit of this, but instead of having to pay full price for this game, you pay $40. And you also are paying your subscription, so you get access to these deals. I think they have already kind of started playing around with that idea with Game Pass, but I don't necessarily know what players are going to respond best to. I know, like me personally, as soon as that Bethesda deal got announced with Game Pass, that basically confirmed that I'm going to be a Game Pass member in perpetuity. Not because like, oh, I love Bethesda. It's just more a commitment to a certain level of quality that spoke to me, to where if I've been able to get Game Pass
4 years when Bethesda makes their next game.
I'd say 3, and then maybe like you get Elder Scrolls at like the end of the console gen. But
I think that's worth emphasizing when you talk about the Bethesda deals. It's like, that doesn't mean Elder Scrolls is coming out next year.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to also note that it's not just like Bethesda Game Studios. They also have like id, the Doom games, as well as Arcane. They have stuff going on there that they'll probably, that streaming tech, that they'll be able to make some of their money back on. But as, again, like, I've been getting Game Pass on sale, like in Canada, $10, like basically at a level of like $7 a month US, $8 a month US. Now that sale price is definitely not sustainable for Microsoft to do, but
it's not even, I mean, do the math, and I've said it on the podcast a bazillion times, multiply the amount of users times $10 a month. It's enough to pay for like 2 AAA games a year, and somehow they're also going to have all of these other games they're paying to have on there. They need to charge way more for this to be sustainable or something. I don't know, right? Like, let's be clear. When people say, "Oh, they announced they're not turning a profit from it yet," right? And eventually, they're going to need to, or it will.
Yeah, I think you'll probably see a price creep like you have with Netflix. I know Netflix's tiers are based upon like how many users can use your account, as well as like the streaming quality. Potentially, maybe on Game Pass, you get locked out of certain games. I don't have any information on that. That's just pure speculation.
Yeah.
But as far as for myself, I kind of see it as, okay, this is about the price of 2 AAA games. Am I expecting to play 2 games or that monetary value on Game Pass within the next year? And for next year, for me, it was yes. So it was like an easy thing for me to do, because not only do I get the games that I was going to pay for, but I also have the ability to expose myself to new games as well, and it's just a better value. I'm one of those people that once I play a game, I'm usually done with it, though. I don't know how.
I think that's most people, especially the older you get.
Yeah, so I think that model, that Game Pass model, speaks to people. Now, on the other end, are those, like, what are you after? Like, are you after like a Sony type game? Are you after the next game from Insomniac, from Santa Monica, from Naughty Dog? Sony has found out that charging that $70 or before $60 but $70 price on a game, plus you're buying your console, that is what is working for them, and they're sticking with it. Personally,
well, and if they make more money doing that, then they can afford to make more games to pull you in.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And just because a lot of the Sony games, first-party games, speak to me, I'm more than happy to kind of fall in line and just pay what they're asking me to do, because I want to see more of that. And to be fair, I also want to see more of Game Pass. Like, I want the promise of Game Pass to kind of live up to what it can be. I think, but I'm just one person. It definitely depends on who you are, what you like. It's going to be something that will have a clear idea of what actually ended up winning out in 5 years, probably 8 years, like end of console gen. It'll be like, oh, Game Pass was something that Sony should have adopted in 2020. That's a pretty good deal.
All right. So here's my question then. If it was $20 a month, would you keep it?
For the way I play, so if I was paying 20 in perpetuity, that's tougher to swallow, right? Now I have to justify
So, but
Yeah,
I'm playing
exactly.
a game. So when's your breaking point? Is your breaking point at 20, 25? Because that's what I'm wondering. Because right now, and this actually, and I've got a couple of links that I'll add in the description. This actually blew my mind. I addressed someone in the comments on a podcast with NX Gamer where he goes, Games Pass is a huge moneymaker. And I'm like, it's not actually. It's not making money. And I didn't realize that the PlayStation wing, I always knew was the most important part probably at this point for Sony, but I didn't know that it was making almost 10 times as much money as all of Xbox's services combined. So how does Games Pass compete with that, my friend, when Sony can afford to, because I've covered this on recent podcasts. I'm not kidding. They plan to possibly release a PlayStation exclusive every month next year. And they're doing so from a position of having plenty of money to fund more every month for years to come. I don't know that Games Pass is ever going to make enough money to do that unless they double or triple the price. And you said you would cancel it.
I think it's going to be hard for anyone to justify.
I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I also have Games Pass.
But anyone to justify a subscription price that is more than the subscription prices they're already paying. So for me, that would mean I wouldn't pay more than like a Netflix subscription. And I think for
10 to 15.
10 to 15, I think that's a reasonable expectation of like consumers. Now, I think Netflix is going to keep like price creeping over time continually, especially with the amount of original content they're producing now. Like Amazon Prime has had like the price creeps as well.
Right, but Amazon has shows like, The Night Manager, The Boys, a bunch of other shows people like. Netflix has Stranger Things and Ozark. These are award-winning shows. Like this is, I think, almost competitive with HBO's caliber of shows, or it's getting there. And so it's like, but is Microsoft doing that yet, though? That's the question. If they were, here's the question I've been thinking of lately. If they were making something on the caliber of like Metal Gear Solids and Gods of Wars, then okay, everyone would subscribe to Games Pass, probably even for $15, $20 a month, especially if they had like 4 or 5 of those AAA games a year. But can they do that? It's a chicken and egg situation. Are they ever going to have enough money to do that? You see what I'm saying? So I just think there are some inherent, because if you watch my videos earlier this year, I had a lot of pro Games Pass videos come out where I thought this was the future. And now I have Games Pass, so I'm not saying that I don't think it could be the future, but now I'm starting to feel this contrarian streak inside of me where I'm like, I think people are acting like I think it could be the future, but I think too many people are acting like it's inevitable when there are some pretty clear red flags in the business model.
I think with the purchase of Bethesda, Microsoft has shown that they're willing to take huge risks. Like they paid more for Bethesda than Disney paid for Star Wars. Like that's
they paid double,
insane.
And
I think Microsoft again does see Google and Amazon as their true competition, and I don't think that really comes to a head until like 10, 15 years from now. I think they're just playing like an incredibly long game to where they're planning out. Like I think this is going to probably, again, tortures are going to come out with that, but I think they've probably conceded that Sony is going to win like any type of hardware race. So Phil Spencer has just been like, okay, like how do we win the next battle? And I don't think Phil Spencer personally has that type of like, we have to win mindset. At least from the interviews I've read, he's a very considerate. He wants people just to play games. At least that's what he puts out into the world. But I do believe he is preparing Xbox for in 10 years, 15 years now, where any type of gaming hardware is very niche because it's like a TV app. It's something that's just integrated into whatever display you happen to have in front of you. I think that is the Xbox play right now. And before then, they just have things in the market right now that are going to carry them so that they stay relevant in the gaming space until that time. But they have started preparing, and they have been preparing for a while for that. I think that is going to become the eventual future.
My point is this. I think it's premature to say there will be a winner or a loser at all yet. For all we know, I don't know. When you boot up the PS5, it gives you 20 free PS4 games. For all we know, Sony's going to do some hybrid solution. For all we know, Microsoft is either going to scale it up or scale it back down. I think it's just premature to declare anything as inevitable yet, because the data doesn't suggest that anything is inevitably happening on either side.
And especially when we're talking 10, 15 years out, it's hard to say anything for certainty. It's just very much a wait and see.
Yeah. Andy Crawley writes in and says, thanks for coming on. So lately I've had a problem staying interested in games long enough to finish them. They're mostly fun for the first half of the game, but if I have to take a break, like work can be really busy, I don't play for a few days at a time, and I end up having to force myself to go back to the game. The end seems almost grinding to try to finish. Have you seen trends like this, and how have developers tried to fix this situation? By the way, for the record, I'm 32 years old with 2 kids and a normal job and gaming all my life. The habits of mine only recently came about since like 6 years ago. Thanks.
This is actually something that a lot of people listening can do themselves, just to kind of get an idea of just game completion in general and these like huge open world or time consuming games, like how many people have actually finished. And it's just to kind of, on PlayStation, it's trophy completion, or how many people have gotten a certain trophy, and on Microsoft, it's achievements. I always kind of like go into the back end and be like, okay, how many people beat Sekiro? Like, how many people have beaten Demon's Souls by this date? That's something that you can also kind of verify yourself and just kind of see anecdotally. Overall, most people do not finish games. An anomaly in modern times has actually been Spider-Man, which not only had like a super high completion percentage, but also a very high platinum completion percentage. And those things, again, that's very rare for a game, but they would kind of go more into a case study about Spider-Man. But the general trend is most people do not finish games, or they take a very long time to finish a game because, like Andy said, they're busy. They have families, they have responsibilities, they have a job. Maybe like I work with people that have 2 hours a week to play games on a Sunday when their kids are out of the house and they're doing whatever they are with friends.
Yeah.
A lot like that's not, it's more, gaming is there for when you can do it. And a lot of games have that in mind. But that being said, I've experienced this a few times to where I completely forget a game, and then I'm having to jump back in and relearn mechanics and like relearn where I was in the story. And that can be very frustrating.
Yeah, I was like a fourth into Sekiro. I can't imagine going back to Sekiro. It's just so daunting. I'm only a fourth in, and it's like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to go back and train with that one guy for like 10 minutes and then hopefully remember in what direction I'm supposed to go. I mean, let me say, I just think that if a game isn't, hopefully you have a disposable income. So I understand the argument of, well, I paid for this and I want to beat it. But I would just say to a certain extent, I think you've got to just be okay with not finishing games. And the older I get, the more I'm like, nope, played Assassin's Creed Odyssey for 20 hours, done. Too bad. Like, I don't want to play that. I want to go play, I just got Wolfenstein Youngblood, even though I have a backlog of 10 games. And so I'm making my peace with it, that as I get older, I have less time. And so because my time's more precious, I'm not going to force myself to finish games.
Yeah, exactly. It's okay to wait, don't get games instantly, wait for a sale if you kind of have a vibe from it, or just stop playing the game. Games are supposed to be fun. And if you're not having fun with the game anymore, hey, It's okay. You can go to something else. Yeah.
So we've been going for a very long time here. I think what I'll do is say, let's just pick up the pace and try to, I think we actually covered almost everything already. You've probably noticed that I've been crossing off certain questions because we already answered them. But we got a few more. Let's kind of power through here. I might paraphrase some of them. Yeah, so My Sharona writes in, which, very cheeky name there. And he asks, basically why, we are seeing Sony run the PS5 run games as well as the Xbox Series X in frame rates. And most of the next gen games, it loads games faster, quite a bit faster in some of them, percentage wise. I mean, it's usually percentage wise, not ultimate time wise. Why didn't Xbox consider this? And I think it's less about like, because the way he asked the question seems to be like, why didn't someone warn Xbox? And I just don't think that's how it works, right? I think they have different design goals. They have different ways of designing consoles. People have noticed actually maybe on my board that says AMD versus Microsoft as a subject for months. And there is a story that I think I am going to be ready to tell in a few months about some behind the scenes things that went on between AMD and Microsoft, just so everyone knows. But I think, how can you speak to just the general idea? I think let's move past the SSD, but like the methodology and how, like, have you noticed from talking to some of your friends who are developers or working at a AAA studio, the methodology that goes into how they design their hardware, the differences and how they think about designing them?
I haven't been exposed to how each console manufacturer handles their own hardware development. A lot of the times, especially in AAA, you just kind of presented with, hey, this is what we came up with. To kind of speak to the decisions being made about what's included and what's not included, that usually comes from first party. But as kind of far as working with developers and each kind of console manufacturer, it does shift. Like typically, and this is really only reading into things from the PS4 generation, but Sony seems, and I think they're actually exhibiting this a little bit right now too with PS5, but they are very interested in developers and indies at the very early stages of a console release, like first year or two. And then they slowly, as the console's maturing and they're hitting sales numbers, they kind of drift away. And I think what ended up happening with PS4 generation is actually Microsoft swooped in a little bit and be like, when Sony was kind of letting the ball go a little bit and started investing more and become more interested in developers. And kind of part of that reason is Game Pass. They want to upsell Game Pass, get the developers on Game Pass. But I think you're also seeing that happen a little bit more into this generation to where, yes, Sony has become more interested in indies again and has been offering support, but Microsoft didn't really ever stop showing developer support. And at least from my anecdotal experience, Microsoft actually does a little bit more than Sony to help.
Seems like lately, yeah.
Yeah, they've definitely become a much more developer-friendly company than they have definitely from the start of the Xbox One generation. And that's really good for those smaller developers. That's really good for getting unique games out there. And it's going to be interesting to see if they keep their attention and when Game Pass is succeeding or Game Pass starts to fail and then they start pushing away developers again. It's going to be an interesting landscape.
So, I mean, but I guess to go back to the question he asked, though, you're basically just saying, like, it's just they just have different ways of coming to a conclusion of what the console should be, right? There was no big, and I've seen people ask this before. There was no big like espionage to hide the SSD from Microsoft or how they were designing things. It's just, and I'll just speak for myself, speaking to some developers, that basically Sony just insisted on going with some architectural choices, and Microsoft kind of insisted on others.
Yeah, from my experience, I've never been exposed to third-party developers having that big of an impact. Perhaps it would swing, like maybe they had more of a say in it.
Oh, sometimes they have, actually. The PS4's amount of RAM came from Gearbox. They said you will put 8 gigabytes in the PS4 if you want to win. A similar thing happened from Cliff Bleszinski in the 360.
Yeah, I remember the Cliff example where they're like, you need this amount of RAM to run Gears of War, it's not going to run, or something like that in the Xbox. But so there is precedent for them kind of considering what developers want out of the next gen, but it's very much up to what makes it into the final build by those different console manufacturers.
So let me see here. I guess this is a fun one. Maybe we can answer quickly. Connor Horry writes in and says, "Hi, Tom and guest. My question is simple, and I hope you guys can expand on it. What do you think are the biggest weaknesses of the PS5 and Xbox Series X menus, and what should they improve? It feels like both haven't made much development in UI this generation. Do you think this was a missed opportunity?"
I think both the PS5 for sure feels like a V1 to me, just because there's so many, in terms of UX, so many rough edges, such as the muscle memory of holding down the PS button to turn off the console. When you tap the PS button to bring up that task menu, it not actually focusing in on those quick settings, but it focuses in on the cards. A double tap opening up a card directly. I think they do have to kind of push the cards because they're trying to push the cards a little bit because of how much investment there is. But there's definitely some things that I've noticed from using a lot of the PS5 at this point where it gets clunky. And I think over time, they kind of proved this with PS4. Over time, a lot of those quirks will just get ironed out and you won't have to worry about them in perpetuity. But some improvements, I think the PS Store being included in PS5 is really, really nice. It's super responsive now.
It was so dumb having a store app. Now it's just in the menu and it's not annoying. It's not like it seems like a common sense thing they should have done a long time ago in hindsight, but maybe the console wasn't strong enough. I don't know.
Yeah, the separation of games and media. Like there's some things that they are trying out that do seem to improve the overall user experience, but there's still like those rough edges and I think some oversights to just, they probably did not expect like that hold the PS button for power off to be like.
I have to say that is a boneheaded choice. I still screw up pressing down and on paper, it's like, why would it be an issue? You press the PlayStation button and then there's this mini menu to turn it off. But it used to be I press it a long time. I don't know why they changed that.
Yeah. With the Series X menus, I believe they're the same as the One X. I had a lot of experience with the One X and just kind of just peeked at the Series X. They seem fairly comparable. I think Sony took like the idea of the integrated, correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but they kind of took the idea of the integrated store from Microsoft. I think the way Microsoft handles a lot of their, what I would call advanced settings, they're, at least in my experience, a little bit more clear than Sony's. They're a little bit more user-friendly.
So here's what I would say. I would say that I agree that the PlayStation 1 feels more like a V1, but I also think the V1 is overall much better than the PS4s, to be honest. Like the sub-menus for settings are, in my opinion, way clearer to get through than the PS4, where the PS4's sub-menus were kind of just in a random order. Like, I honestly don't know. Like, I actually think the menu for the PS5 is overall really good, but at the same time, it is a V1 in that it's like, well, right here, maybe this should have the drop down for every game, do this, and so I don't know, right? I actually like what they did, especially kind of separating the menu into a games section. Then you press R1, you just switch to the media version of the menu. You switch between Hulu and YouTube and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, that was something that should have been done a long time ago, actually. So I'd say overall, it's actually much easier to use in most parts of the menu. There are just some parts where it's like, this is weird. I don't know why they did this.
Yeah. I definitely, and for sure. I do overall think Xbox's is a little bit user-friendly, but I am going off of memory. I don't have a Series X. I don't know if you have a Series X.
The Series X menu works,
exactly.
I think it works. I just think that there are some fundamental changes to the menu that would make more sense. And I assume both of them are going to update it, so...
Yeah, exactly. Like these are what the consoles launch with. If you look at any example over time, they dramatically change what the UI looks like, usually within a year or two. Definitely on the Microsoft side, a little less so on the Sony side, but it's just more a story of refinement. I think a lot of the quirks that people are hung up on will be alleviated over time. They won't be there in perpetuity, but gotta wait and see.
Clean Sweep writes in and says, for AAA developers, are things like forums, like on Steam or something, and game-specific subreddits the best conduit for getting information to and from game devs? If not, is there even such a thing? Especially when devs, community managers have to shift through tons of posts of highly variable quality. Yeah, variable quality is one way of putting it.
Yeah, it's a very PC way of putting that. Definitely reviews are a way that you always get, developers always pay attention to reviews and read the reviews, especially the negative ones. Also with like the social media posts and just like the response after games out, they pay attention to a lot, which is I think why you see when a game does not meet expectations or it like ships with bugs, or there's an outcry by the community that probably pre-ordered the game that, hey, this thing you promised is not what you promised. A lot of the developers look at that information. Ongoing games, those community managers are constantly giving information to the development team and what the community wants. As far as those things get enacted, still has to go through like the normal vetting process within even just a corporation period. But social media is definitely, from this is people telling me their experience of like before and after, just because I was also interested in this, like how did we get information before subreddits and social media, and how are we getting it now? It has definitely highlighted the vocal minority, but in some aspects, knowing what people are just saying about your game also helps a lot. And whether you make a decision based on that is totally something separate. But a lot of these developers are reading everything, which is try to be constructive with criticisms, because you are probably someone who has a family and has worked years on a game, is seeing exactly what you're putting out there. So
I think be constructive and polite in criticisms is something that I would also like to ask for some comments as well. You know, when it comes to feedback, I've noticed DICE, I just think it seems to be different depending on the studio. Like DICE seems to do a good job with they have a subreddit where they've answered my questions. Like they're pretty good.
That's great.
But that's not all subreddits. And then, you know, there's like developers like From Software where it's impossible to talk to them about anything, like to the point that it's ridiculous. But then there's, you know, Guerrilla Games did some interesting thing with Shadowfall where they made a feedback website where you had so many points you could spend to give feedback a month. And if you suggested good feedback that was upvoted by others, you got more points.
Interesting.
And I remember that too, because I got the most upvoted one month, and they made my weapons pack idea in the game. So that was one that I felt like I was completely part of helping them steer the game, you know. And I think it's just, I don't know, right? It just depends on the studio. They all handle it differently, and some of them, like From Software, are impossible to talk to, and some of them, like Guerrilla and DICE, are very easy to have a dialogue with.
Yeah, exactly. It all kind of studio by studio, publisher by publisher, community manager by community manager.
The final question I have here, at least as a bullet point, is one that I brought up to you before, and one that I brought up to my Patreon members, is it's like, get a game dev on. And it's like, you guys, well, I have sources that are game devs. None of them will go on the record, you know, almost ever. It's not like if someone, you know, works for, even anonymously, like the server engineer is willing to go on the record eventually. You know, some people that work at like AIB is like, I had Sapphire Ed, you know, from, you know, he came on, you know, but when it comes to game devs, none of them want their voices on the record. You are the closest we've been able to get. You know, why do you think that is?
It definitely comes down to livelihood. There's, like, I know friends at certain studios. Some studios are a little bit more lax and give some rope. Other studios, it's if like a word or anything, and they have people like constantly reviewing stuff, it's you're like gone. Like, it has a lot to do with worrying about your job. Like, are you going to be able to make money when comments that you've made come out? Like, there's, I think, some a story that we were talking about with a Crytek engineer before we started recording, where he
talked about both consoles, and this was in April of this year. And he said, "Hey guys, based on the dev kits we're using, the PlayStation 5 seems to be outperforming the Xbox slightly in most third-party games." And he got a huge slap on the wrist, it seems, for saying that publicly. Everyone, all the fanboys attacked him for it. And yet, lo and behold, here we are at the console's launch. And that seems to be the truth, I think it's because, if you ask me, it's like you're just going to piss off Microsoft or piss off Sony. I mean,
with that
I don't know.
Yes. With that example specifically, you don't want to affect the relationships you have with one console manufacturer because of comments you made about the other one. You don't want to be seen plain favoritism. When you're Crytek, on an individual level, it's more, I don't want my job jeopardized, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and then it's just weird because this whole year we've seen fanboys clinging to, none of my sources are Sony or Microsoft. Yeah, none of them are Microsoft or Sony devs. Some people assume they are because I reported some things that were construed as being supporting one side or the other. I'm just reporting the news. So I don't have anyone from Sony, and you don't see anyone. But that's the annoying thing, because then publicly on Twitter, only the Sony devs are the ones saying the best things. But of course they are. They work for Sony, right? Of course they're saying good things about the PS5. So it's hard to trust that. But then you see people blowing out of proportion, like the Sony Liverpool devs, which Sony closed the Liverpool studio 8 years ago for underperforming. I wouldn't be listening to people from there, by the way, guys. And it just becomes a pile of misinformation. It's very frustrating not having people that I talk to at DICE or, Crystal Dynamic or some of these other third-party studios come on the record. It sucks, because basically I have no way of proving I'm not a fanboy if no one will speak on the record.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of why the reason why I won't disclose the studio I used to work for. It's mostly has to do with, am I revealing anything that could get me apprehended? A lot of developers, even to their friends that perhaps work at other studios or work at these console manufacturers, if their friend sees a comment that they made, using the example of that Crytek employee, that can affect his personal relationships could get affected by that comment reaching someone else. So I think a lot of devs, and I shouldn't say this is a blanket statement on why some devs will be willing to talk and some people won't. I think as far as disclosing information about the console manufacturers and the inner workings, it'll always be very hard to get any type of those people on record. But as far as kind of what we're almost doing here, where I would be surprised if a developer wouldn't be willing to come on and just kind of give their opinion on the industry without giving away any NDA information. But as far as some might...
Well, hey, if you want to and you're listening, please reach out.
Yeah, and if you want to challenge some of the things that we've discussed too, it'd be interesting as well, just to kind of hear other opinions. I think that's kind of a bigger takeaway for me. I'd love to hear more developer opinions too, whether they're the same as my developer friends, or if their experience at a studio is similar or different than mine. We get that sometimes, but it's becoming, at least from what I've been seeing, a little bit more rare. I think we actually saw a lot of it more a few years ago. Perhaps it's because we're in the middle of a console launch that we're seeing less of it, but I do want to hear about experiences and opinions of the people that are actually making the things we love to partake in and enjoy as a hobby.
Yeah. All right. Well, truly the final question then. Gerard, the audio engineer for Moore's Law is Dead, emailed me a question, and he asks, what is the one thing you wish more gamers knew about game development that would help us appreciate more of what you guys do?
Game developers are not lazy, ever. They that is something every time I see it. I think before I was in the industry, I was just you kind of jump on sometimes you jump on the bandwagon, especially if you're younger. You're just like, oh yeah, this didn't get in this game. Like, how could you? But when you work in the industry and you're just exposed to your colleagues, like spending like hours and hours making sure that a test goes okay, and you're spending hours making sure like just
that this room's lighting looks correct.
Yeah, the room's lighting looks correct. You want to make sure this one bug that you've been trailing for weeks is resolved. So like something like people experience the game how it's intended. They by no means have I ever met a lazy game developer, or has there ever I've been exposed to any type of lazy decision making. Everything is very intentional. And although sometimes there's mistakes made, calling someone, especially a game developer, lazy is just wildly inaccurate. I still kind of cringe when I see it, just because seeing them in practice is very illuminating too.
It's like this thing you see repeated in the comments constantly, right? Just this whole thing of like, well, remember, game devs are lazy. And, the more I speak to game developers as sources, the more there's no point where he's like, I'm going to be honest, it doesn't run well because fuck PC gamers. There's no point where someone said that or goes, it's because we hate Sony that this game runs this way. That's not how this works. I've never heard there's always specific reasons a specific engine did this or that. And again, the best example I can come up with is when one person reached out to me about a year ago to explain like the development of several games and like goes through like, look, the reason these PC ports, quote unquote, were bad is because we were designing for these $400 360s and PS3s that had 6 threads or more. And unfortunately, most PC gamers had dual cores. So we didn't know what to do with the game engine, especially when we knew quad cores were going to be standard in a few years. So we just did our best. We weren't lazy. Your PC just had a weaker processor. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't laziness, that when everyone said, well, that was a bad port or something.
Yeah, I echo that. Game developers are not lazy. Please, if you're trying to give critiques and stuff to game developers, calling them lazy is a surefire way to make sure your point's never heard by them.
I bet that's the quickest way to turn them
Very
off from
much
reading
so.
The rest of your message.
Yeah, just because it shows a level of ignorance to where they like, why would I consider someone's opinion that isn't even doing the legwork to investigate what I do for a living?
Yeah, it'd be like if someone was like going to ask to give feedback on something and they opened up by saying something entirely incorrect and derogatory about your entire industry or something.
Yeah, exactly. That's very much what it is like.
All right. Well, I do think that we've gone along as long as we can. There were some reader mails we didn't get to that I've thrown into the mailbag that I believe if I need to consult you, I will, or that I can answer myself. So don't worry if you didn't get your question answered. I'll get to it whenever we can in the die shrinks that follow this for patrons. And otherwise, I think even if we didn't directly say your question, I'm pretty sure we got to 90% of them and did so over the course of what we'll see if this ends up being the longest episode after editing. I'm not sure, but we'll find out.
I would really like that record as far as a Broken Silicon episode.
Well, you can tell. Well, no, now Gerard says you were trying to get that as a record, so you can speak.
No, no, I only started thinking about that when we had to do some extra technical setup. I was like, oh, this might be one of them. This might be it.
This might be the one that finally pushes it over. I think the first NX Gamer episode is still the longest running one. But you know what? I think it was a good conversation. I think it was a nice breath of fresh air for me, actually. I'll just speak for myself from just constantly talking about the hardware and actually talking about everything that we use the hardware for, which I think a lot of people this fall have lost sight of what they're getting the hardware to play, the games. Thanks for coming on, and I'm sure we'll speak again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Big fan, and keep doing what you're doing.
I'll try. The following podcast was brought to you by the YouTube channel and website Moore's Law is Dead. Moore's Law is Dead and Broken Silicon are trademarks of their creator, Tom. That guy is me, and I am indeed the creator, editor, writer, and showrunner of Moore's Law is Dead podcasts, videos, articles, and other media. However, Moore's Law is Dead is a team, with Broken Silicon co-hosted by my brother, Dan, audio editing by Gerard Cortez, and select technical editing by Carbon Cry. You can find all of our information, including how to get a hold of us, at www.mooreslawsdead.com. And if you are a fan and would like to send mail or other hardware, please mail parcels to Moore's Law is Dead, P.O. Box 10468, Peoria, Illinois 61612. And speaking of fans, without exaggeration, the patrons are responsible for the continued distribution of the content you just listened to. And so if you have some extra money, but only if you do, please consider supporting us. For just $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive podcast Die Shrink, voting on subjects of future podcast episodes, the ability to have your questions read aloud on Broken Silicon, Die Shrink, and Loose Ends, and of course, the Moore's Law is Dead Discord full of like-minded people who would love to meet you. I am one of them. And at higher tiers, you get access to ad-free episodes of Broken Silicon, the back catalog of Flyover States podcast, thanks in the credits of videos and podcasts, and other perks as well. And if you cannot afford to support us, please just share Moore's Law is Dead videos and podcasts with friends and family on social media and Reddit. And give Broken Silicon and Flyover States a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. All of this really does help so much more than I think anyone realizes. If you'd like to advertise on the podcast or a person of interest who would like to be a guest, please reach out to the email address mlhbdead@gmail.com. But as I said, this podcast would not be possible without its fans supporting it. And so now it is time to give a personal thanks to the greatest of the fans. The following supporters are at the 10 gigahertz or higher producer levels. Matthew McMullen, Telos, Dean, Benny Berlin, Justin Yant, Thomas Rupp, I Love You, Lynn and Jim Bollocks, Joshua Alvin, Muhammad Al-Kawari, Frederick Lau, James Crassa, Justin Parrish, Zachary Martin, Terrence Herod, Brad Medlin, Phil F., Courtney Elliott, The Ninth Dude, Greg Renegard, TSBCFS, Chrysantine, Travis Gooding, The Mechanical Philosopher, Lebo Kinkilo, Fatboy D. Saru, Daniel Hyde, D. Kunke, Christoph Novak, Jack O'Neill, Matt Salem, Aaron Close, Juan Garcia, VI Pass, Sadler, Isaiah Gosner, Alethros, Telos, Hey There's a Kitty, Greg T. Wanchik, Jacob Barber, Exodi, Hector Santana, Matthew Lane, Joe McMorrow, Jan Rauner, Rubber Duck, Street of Full, Ali Robertson, Eric Jackson, Jonathan, Sean Grant, Evan Dingle, Dominique Cox, Stefan, Original Ross, Sam MacArthur, Total Silo, Sol Connor, Michael Costa, Andrew S., Blake, Aaron Keith, Kerry Baldino, Endless Loggins, Tom San Filippo, Justice Brennan, Ivan K., Trevor Powers, Cyan Nora, Alenia, Joshua Staveness, Daniel Nishbal, Franco Frederic, Hardware Numbers, Alex Carastillo, Dark Rain 2049, Leighton Perry, Joseph Karaman, Carlos Feldes, Carnivore Bear, Macdo226, Saber Z Birds, Licky, Matt Berzagi, David Cowden, Ricky Tan, Garanadin, Patrick J.S., Justin Staples, Freddie Canoas Jr., Christopher Foster, Kiwi Phil, Joaquim Hagan, Sarah Light, Anthony Gareffa, Matthew Griffin, Alex, Joseph Loria, Colin Marco, Deke, Cheesy Ramen, Raul Abaneni, Master Andy Wan, Jake Dude 23, Brian Riggleman, Chris Williams, Ryan Deniscu, Dave McCoy, Valco Malev, Miss Sears, Paul Bogdan, Morton Svensson, Andrew Thomas Summers, Maurice Courtois, Matthew J. Link, Mose from Oz, Mai Sharona, Derek File, Roman, Jacob Stankiewicz, Jake Pym, Wakir Khan, JBG, Stephen Hart, Christopher A. Butler, Charles Antoine Futeau, Peter Moore, Chris Licata, Justin Thomas, Sam Miller, James Kitchens, Kevin Chen, Shakir, Dean Dispotsky, Paul J., My Name is Nobody, Ruben Marr, Luis Correa, John Jamison, Eshel Dar Epstein, Luca, Anders Bervin, Matthew Lazier, Tim Robbins, hardforum.com, Susanna Maria, Stu, Dystopia, Arpit Sharma, and of course, thank you to Sahara for the music.